The city is quiet, the lights are low. You've closed the door on the day's noise, and now we dive into the silence. Welcome to Midnight Narrative. This content is a narrative based on public records and is intended as a non graphic, peaceful bedtime story. Tonight, the case file is open on Aileen Wuornos. There is a particular cruelty in betrayal by the person you love most. It is not the sharp, sudden violence of a stranger's attack, but a slow unwinding of trust, a dismantling of the one safe place you thought you had in the world. For Aileen Wuornos, who had been betrayed by every institution and nearly every person she had ever known, the betrayal by Tyria Moore was perhaps the deepest cut of all, and it happened not face to face, but through telephone wires, with police officers listening to every word, recording every confession, turning love into evidence. The interrogation room at the Volusia County Sheriff's Office, where Tyria Moore sat on January 14th, 1991, was designed to be deliberately uncomfortable. The walls were bare concrete block, painted an institutional beige that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The table was metal, bolted to the floor, cold to the touch. The chairs were hard plastic, the kind that made your back ache after an hour. A recording device sat in the center of the table, its reels turning slowly, capturing everything. Tyria had been brought there from Pennsylvania, transported by investigators who had spent the journey explaining to her exactly what she was facing. They showed her photographs of the victims, crime scene images that made her stomach turn. They explained the forensic evidence, her fingerprints in Peter Seams's car, her name in pawnshop records, witness statements placing her at the scene of the Orange Springs crash. They told her that Florida had the death penalty, that she could be charged as an accomplice to 7 murders, that she was looking at execution or life in prison without parole unless she cooperated. The deal was straightforward and brutal in its simplicity. Help us get a confession from Aileen Wuornos, and we will grant you complete immunity. You will not be charged. You will walk away from this, but you have to give us something we can use in court. Investigator Bruce Munster sat across from Tyria, a tape recorder between them, explaining how the phone calls would work. You need to get her to admit to the killings, he said. We need her to say on tape that she murdered these men. Can you do that? Tyria's hands were shaking. She had been crying on and off for hours, her eyes red and swollen, her face blotchy. I don't know if she'll tell me, she said. Lee doesn't trust anyone. She trusts you, Munster said. You're the only person she trusts. That's why this will work. What do I say to her? Tyria asked. Tell her the truth, Munster said. Tell her the police came to see your family. Tell her you're scared. Tell her you're worried you're going to be charged as an accessory. Make her think that confessing is the only way to protect you. Tyria nodded slowly, though everything inside her was screaming to refuse, to walk away, to maintain whatever shred of loyalty she still felt toward the woman she had loved. But self preservation was stronger than loyalty. She did not want to die. She did not want to spend her life in prison. She wanted to go home, to Ohio, to her family, to a life that did not include murder and police interrogations and the weight of 7 dead men. Okay, she said quietly, I'll do it. The first call was placed on January 14th, late in the evening. Investigators had confirmed that Aileen was still at the Fairview Motel, still unaware that Tyria had been taken into custody. The phone in Aileen's room rang 4 times before she answered, her voice thick with sleep and alcohol. Yeah? Lee? It's Ty. There was a pause, a sharp intake of breath, and then Aileen's voice changed completely, becoming alert, almost panicked. Ty, Jesus Christ, where are you? I've been going out of my mind. Are you okay? I'm okay, Tyria said, and her voice broke slightly, despite her efforts to control it. I'm at my sister's place, in Pennsylvania. Why didn't you tell me you were leaving? Aileen asked, and there was hurt beneath the panic. I came back and you were just gone. I thought something happened to you. I needed to get away, Tyria said. Lee, I'm scared. The police came to see my mom. They're asking about me, about us. The silence on the other end of the line stretched out, heavy and loaded. The investigators watching Tyria could see her hands trembling, could see her fighting to maintain her composure. What did they say? Aileen asked finally, her voice careful, controlled. They're saying people are dead, Tyria said. They're saying men have been murdered and they think we're involved. Lee, what's going on? Nothing's going on, Aileen said quickly. Those sketches don't look anything like us. Nobody's going to recognize us from those. My mom recognized me, Tyria said. She saw them on TV and she knew it was me. Lee, if she knew, other people are going to know too. Listen to me, Aileen said, and her voice took on a harder edge. You didn't do anything. You weren't involved in anything. If the cops come to talk to you, you just tell them you don't know what they're talking about. But I do know, Tyria said, pushing now, following the script the investigators had given her. Lee, I was there. I was in that car. They found my fingerprints. That doesn't mean anything, Aileen insisted. You were just riding with me. You didn't do anything wrong. Then what did you do? Tyria asked, her voice rising slightly. Lee, please. I need to know what's happening. I need to know the truth. The truth is, I love you, Aileen said, and her voice cracked. The truth is, you're the only good thing that ever happened to me, and I'm not going to let anything happen to you. The call ended there, Aileen hanging up abruptly, and Tyria sat back in her chair, exhaling slowly. The investigators made notes, discussed strategy, decided to try again the next day. The second call was made on January 15th. This time, Aileen answered on the first ring, as though she had been waiting by the phone. Ty? Yeah, it's me, Tyria said. Lee, I can't stop thinking about what you said, about loving me. I love you too. You know that, right? I know, Aileen said quietly, but I need you to help me understand, Tyria continued. The police are saying terrible things. They're saying you killed people, men, that you shot them and took their cars. Who told you that? Aileen asked sharply. My mom, Tyria said. The police told her. They showed her evidence, pictures. Lee, they know. They know everything. Another long silence. Tyria could hear Aileen breathing on the other end of the line, could almost feel the war happening inside her, the desire to confess, to share the burden, warring against the instinct to protect herself, to maintain the lie. I didn't want to hurt anyone, Aileen said finally, her voice so quiet Tyria had to strain to hear it. I never wanted any of this. What happened? Tyria asked gently, and the investigators leaned forward, watching her intently. They hurt me first, Aileen said, every single one of them. They picked me up and they hurt me, and I had to defend myself. What was I supposed to do? Just let them rape me? Just let them kill me? How many were there? Tyria asked. All of them, Aileen said. All the ones they're talking about. But Ty, I swear to God, it was self defense. They were going to hurt me. I had to protect myself. The confession, partial and couched in justification, was on tape, but the investigators wanted more. They wanted specifics, names, details that would hold up in court. They had Tyria make 3 more calls over the next 2 days, each one pushing a little harder, each one designed to elicit more information. On the third call, January 16th, Tyria broke down crying, begging Aileen to turn herself in. They're going to charge me, Lee, she said, her voice dissolving into sobs. They're saying I'm an accessory. They're saying I knew what you did and I helped you. I could go to prison for the rest of my life. No, Aileen said fiercely. No, that's not going to happen. I won't let that happen. Then you have to tell them the truth, Tyria said. You have to tell them it was all you, that I didn't know, that I wasn't involved. I can't, Aileen said. If I tell them anything, they'll kill me. They'll give me the death penalty. And if you don't, They'll kill me, Tyria said. Lee, please, I'm begging you. If you love me, you'll do this. You'll tell them the truth so I can go free. The manipulation was cruel but effective. Aileen, who had killed 7 men in part to provide for Tyria, who had convinced herself that everything she did was to keep them together, could not withstand the thought of Tyria going to prison because of her. Okay, Aileen said, her voice breaking. Okay, I'll tell them. I'll confess to everything. But you have to promise me something. What? Tyria asked. You have to promise me you'll be okay, Aileen said. You have to promise me you'll go home and have a good life, and you'll remember that I loved you. I promise, Tyria said, though the words felt like ash in her mouth. The final call ended, and Tyria sat in the interrogation room, staring at the tape recorder, knowing what she had just done. The investigators were pleased, congratulating her, telling her she had done well, that the confessions would be invaluable at trial. They assured her that the immunity deal would hold, that she would not be charged, that she could go home. But Tyria felt hollow, emptied out. She had betrayed the woman who loved her, had manipulated her into a confession that would almost certainly result in a death sentence. She told herself it was survival, that she had no choice, that Aileen had brought this on herself. But beneath those justifications was the knowledge that she had chosen her own freedom over Aileen's life, and that choice would stay with her forever. The arrest of Aileen Carol Wuornos did not take place at the Last Resort Bar, though that location would become part of the mythology surrounding the case, referenced in films and documentaries as the symbolic endpoint of her freedom. The actual arrest occurred on January 9th, 1991, but the atmospheric truth of that moment, the rain, the neon, the sense of an ending, belongs to the broader landscape of her final days of freedom. In the nights before her arrest, Aileen did frequent the last resort, seeking the familiar comfort of cheap beer and anonymous company. The bar was a relic of old Florida, the kind of place that had existed long before the theme parks and resort hotels transformed the state into a sanitized tourist destination. It sat on a corner lot in Daytona Beach, a low slung building with a tin roof that amplified the sound of rain into a constant drumming rhythm. Neon beer signs hummed in the windows: Budweiser, Miller, Pabst, casting red and blue light onto the wet pavement outside. Aileen would sit at the bar on those final nights, smoking Marlboros down to the filter, the ash growing long before she remembered to flick it into the tray. She drank vodka and beer, alternating between them, her tolerance so high that it took hours and significant money to achieve the numbness she sought. The bartender, who had known her for years, served her without comment, recognizing the look of someone in free fall, but seeing it too often to remark upon it. The rain fell steadily those January nights, the winter weather system that had settled over Florida, bringing an unusual chill and persistent precipitation. The rain drummed on the tin roof of the last resort, creating a white noise that Aileen found almost comforting. It reminded her of sleeping in her car, of the thousands of nights she had spent alone, listening to rain hit metal and glass, waiting for morning. She knew they were coming for her. The composite sketches had been everywhere, and though she told herself and Tyria that no one would recognize them, she knew better. She had seen the way motel clerks looked at her now, the hesitation before they handed over room keys. She had seen bartenders glance at the TV when the news came on, then glance back at her, their eyes calculating, wondering if the reward money was worth making a phone call, and Tyria was gone. That absence was perhaps the clearest sign that the end was near. Tyria had left, had fled, and though Aileen tried to convince herself that it was just temporary, that Tyria would come back, some part of her knew the truth. Tyria had seen the sketches and had run, and Aileen was alone again, as she had always been, as she had always known she would be. On the night of January 8th, Aileen sat at the last resort until closing time, 2 a.m. long after most of the other patrons had left. The rain had intensified, coming down in sheets, and she was in no hurry to walk back to the Fairview Motel in the downpour. She ordered one more beer, nursed it slowly, smoked one more cigarette. The television above the bar was tuned to late night programming, and during a commercial break, the composite sketches appeared again, accompanied by a news update about the highway murders. The task force is asking anyone with information about these women to call the tip line. A reward of $15,000 is being offered for information leading to an arrest. Aileen stared at her own face on the screen, rendered in the crude lines of a police sketch, but recognizable nonetheless. The woman in the drawing looked hard, angular, dangerous. It was and wasn't her. A version of herself as seen through the eyes of witnesses who had glimpsed her for mere moments, who had seen the surface but not the depth, the violence but not the pain beneath it. The bartender glanced at the TV, then at Aileen, and for a moment their eyes met. Aileen saw the recognition there, saw him making the connection, and she waited to see what he would do. But he just looked away, went back to wiping down the bar, said nothing. Whether this was kindness, indifference, or fear, Aileen couldn't tell. But he let her finish her beer, and when she stood to leave, he called out to her. "Be safe out there," he said. Aileen nodded and walked out into the rain. The actual arrest occurred the following afternoon, January 9th, and it was less dramatic than the mythology suggests, but no less final. Aileen had spent the morning drinking in her motel room, the television on but ignored, her mind cycling through her limited options. She could run, leave Florida, disappear into another state under another name, but she had no money, no car that wasn't stolen, no energy left for flight. She could turn herself in, try to explain, try to make them understand that she had been defending herself, but she knew how that would go. She was a prostitute, a criminal, a woman who had killed 7 men. No jury would believe her, or she could wait for them to come, which they inevitably would, and face whatever came next. She chose to wait. At approximately 3 p.m., there was a knock on the door of her motel room. Aileen, sitting on the edge of the bed, knew immediately what it was. The knock was too firm, too official. It was not a maid asking about towels or the motel manager collecting rent. It was the sound of inevitability. She stood, walked to the door, opened it. 5 officers stood outside, hands on their weapons, faces serious and wary. "Aileen Carol Wuornos?" one of them asked. "Yeah," she said. "You're under arrest for the murder of Richard Mallory," the officer said. "Put your hands behind your head and get down on your knees." Aileen complied without resistance. She knelt on the cheap carpet, laced her fingers behind her head, and felt the cold metal of handcuffs close around her wrists. The officers searched the room quickly, efficiently, looking for weapons or evidence. They found her bag containing the .22 caliber pistol that had killed 7 men, and they bagged it carefully as evidence. She was pulled to her feet, walked out of the motel room into the parking lot where patrol cars were parked, their lights flashing. A small crowd had gathered, other motel guests, passers-by, people drawn by the spectacle of law enforcement in action. Aileen was placed in the back of a patrol car, her head guided down to avoid hitting the door frame. The door closed and locked. As the car pulled away from the Fairview Motel, Aileen looked back through the rear window at the building where she had spent her final night of freedom. It was unremarkable, anonymous, one of hundreds of identical structures lining the highways of Florida. But it was the last place she had been Lee Aileen, a person rather than a suspect. From this moment forward, she would be the defendant, the accused, the serial killer. Her humanity would be subsumed into her crimes. The drive to the Volusia County Jail took less than 15 minutes. Aileen sat in silence, watching the familiar streets of Daytona Beach pass by. the bars and gas stations and truck stops where she had worked and survived for years. The city looked different from the back of a police car, the landscape of her life suddenly foreign and inaccessible. At the jail, she was processed through booking. Her personal effects were cataloged and confiscated. She was fingerprinted again, photographed again, the mugshot that would define her in the public imagination, captured by an impersonal camera. She was given a medical examination, asked questions about her mental health history, her substance use, her risk of suicide. She answered mechanically, her mind elsewhere, already beginning the process of dissociation that would characterize much of her incarceration. She was placed in isolation, separated from the general jail population, both for her protection and because of the high profile nature of her case. The cell was 8 by 10 feet. Concrete block walls painted the same institutional beige as the interrogation rooms. There was a metal bed frame bolted to the wall with a thin mattress, a metal toilet and sink combination, a small shelf, no windows, fluorescent lights that never fully turned off, just dimmed slightly at night. Aileen sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall. She did not cry. She felt numb, emptied out as though the arrest had been the final draining of whatever emotional reserve she had left. She thought about Tyria, wondered where she was, whether she was safe, whether she thought about Aileen at all. She thought about the 7 men she had killed, their faces already beginning to blur together in her memory. She thought about her brother Keith, dead at 21, and wondered if he was waiting for her somewhere, if death would be a reunion or just another abandonment. The interrogation began the next day. Investigators Bruce Munster, Larry Horzapa, and several others from the task force sat across from Aileen in the same interrogation room where Tyria had sat days earlier. The tape recorder was running. Aileen had been read her Miranda rights and had waived her right to an attorney, a decision that would later be questioned and challenged, but which she made in the moment, perhaps believing that cooperation would help her, that honesty would count for something. The investigators were skilled at their work. They started gently, asking about her background, her childhood, her relationship with Tyria. They expressed sympathy for the hard life she had lived, the abuse she had endured. They positioned themselves as understanding, as people who wanted to hear her side of the story. Aileen, we know this hasn't been easy for you, Munster said. We know you've had a rough life. We've looked into your background. We know about your grandfather, about what happened to you when you were a kid. Nobody ever helped me, Aileen said quietly. Nobody ever gave a shit. We care, Horzapa said. We want to understand what happened. We want to hear your version of events. And Aileen, desperate for someone to listen, desperate to explain, began to talk. She told them about Richard Mallory, about how he had picked her up, how he had become violent, how she had shot him in self defense. She told them about the others, each story following the same pattern. She had been hitchhiking or prostituting. The men had picked her up. They had driven to secluded areas. They had attacked her or threatened her, and she had defended herself. They were going to rape me, she said. They were going to kill me. I had to shoot them. It was them or me. The investigators listened, took notes, asked clarifying questions. They did not challenge her narrative directly, not yet. They wanted her to keep talking, to provide details that could be verified or refuted, to build a record that could be used at trial. Aileen, can you tell us about David Spears? Munster asked. Aileen frowned, trying to remember. There had been so many men, so many cars, so many transactions. The names meant nothing to her. I don't know names, she said. They didn't tell me their names. He was driving a pickup truck, Horzapa prompted. You met him in May. Oh, yeah, Aileen said, the memory surfacing. Yeah, I remember him. He picked me up on the turnpike, said he wanted a date. We drove to this wooded area and he got aggressive, started grabbing me, trying to force me. I told him no. I told him I would give him his money back, but he wouldn't stop. So I shot him. How many times did you shoot him? Munster asked. I don't know, Aileen said. I just kept shooting until he stopped. The interrogation continued for hours, the investigators walking Aileen through each murder, extracting details, building their case. Aileen's accounts were inconsistent, the details changing as she talked, timelines confused. But the basic confession remained. She had killed the men, all of them, and she claimed it had been self defense. At no point did the investigators believe the self defense narrative. The forensic evidence contradicted it too thoroughly. The multiple gunshot wounds, the trajectories suggesting the victims were not attacking when they were shot, the absence of defensive wounds or signs of struggle. But they let Aileen talk, let her believe they were sympathetic, and they recorded everything. By the time the interrogation ended, late in the evening of January 10th, the investigators had a full confession on tape. Aileen had admitted to killing Richard Mallory, David Spears, Charles Carskadden, Troy Burris, Dick Humphreys, and Walter Antonio. She had provided enough details about the Peter Seams case to make clear she was responsible for his disappearance and presumed murder as well, though without a body, that case would remain circumstantially proven. Aileen was returned to her cell, exhausted and emotionally drained. She had told her story, had explained herself, had tried to make them understand. She believed, or wanted to believe, that the confession would help her, that people would see she had been a victim forced to become a killer. She did not yet understand that her words had sealed her fate, that the confession would be used to convict her, that sympathy was not something the criminal justice system had to offer women like her. The media frenzy that followed Aileen's arrest was unlike anything Florida had seen since the Ted Bundy case a decade earlier. The composite sketches had already generated significant public interest, but the arrest transformed that interest into obsession. Aileen Wuornos was not just a killer, she was a phenomenon, a mystery, a walking contradiction of everything society believed about women and violence. Female serial killers were extraordinarily rare. The FBI's data showed that approximately 90% of serial killers were male. Women who killed multiple victims were usually poisoners or angels of death who murdered in medical settings, not violent predators who used guns. The image of a woman hitchhiking along highways, luring men to secluded locations, and shooting. The execution style was so outside the established paradigm that it captured the public imagination completely. The press descended on Daytona Beach within hours of the arrest announcement. National networks sent correspondents and camera crews. Tabloid reporters checked into local hotels, bribing jail employees for information, staking out the courthouse, interviewing anyone who had ever known Aileen. The story was on the front page of every major newspaper, the New York Times, the Washington Post, USA Today, and led the evening news broadcasts. The headlines were sensational and often dehumanizing. Female serial killer arrested in Florida, highway murders. Damsel of death, prostitute confesses to 7 killings. Highway hooker turned hunter. The coverage focused on the novelty of a female killer, the lurid details of her work as a prostitute, the dramatic elements of her life story. There was little empathy, little attempt to understand the context of her crimes, little recognition of her humanity. Photographs of Aileen from her booking became ubiquitous. Her mugshot, face weathered and hard, eyes empty, expression flat, was reproduced in newspapers and magazines and on television, becoming the visual shorthand for female violence. The image was dissected by psychologists and criminologists, analyzed for signs of psychopathy or mental illness, used as evidence of her monstrousness. Tyria Moore's involvement was initially kept secret, protected by the immunity deal, but details began to leak. And within weeks, the press had identified her as Aileen's girlfriend and learned about the recorded phone calls. The story became even more sensational: a lesbian relationship, a betrayal, one lover turning on another to save herself. The coverage was often homophobic, treating the relationship between Aileen and Tyria as aberrant and pathological, evidence of moral corruption. The victims and their families were often secondary in the media coverage, mentioned briefly but not centered. Richard Mallory, David Spears, Charles Carskadden, Troy Burris, Dick Humphreys, Walter Antonio, they were reduced to names on a list, plot points in the story of Aileen Wuornos. Their humanity, their lives, their families' grief were overshadowed by the spectacle of the woman who had killed them. Some family members spoke to the media, trying to reclaim their loved ones from the narrative. Shirley Humphreys, widow of Dick Humphreys, gave interviews describing her husband as a dedicated public servant, a loving father, a good man who did not deserve what happened to him. Dee Spears spoke about David, about his work ethic and his devotion to their family. Their voices were heard but quickly drowned out by the louder, more sensational story of Aileen. Legal proceedings began immediately. Aileen was formally charged with 6 counts of first-degree murder, the cases for which bodies and substantial evidence existed. The Peter Seams case was left uncharged initially, pending further investigation and the possible recovery of his body. Public defenders were assigned to represent Aileen, attorneys from the Conflict Regional Counsel Office who specialized in capital cases. They were competent, dedicated lawyers, but they were also overwhelmed and underfunded, facing a case that had already been tried and convicted in the court of public opinion. The prosecution, led by State Attorney John Tanner and Assistant State Attorney David Damore, announced their intention to seek the death penalty. Florida law required that certain aggravating factors be present to justify capital punishment, and the prosecution argued that multiple aggravating factors existed. The murders were committed during the course of a robbery. They were especially heinous and cruel, and Aileen had a prior criminal record. The defense faced an impossible task. Aileen had confessed. The forensic evidence was overwhelming. The media had already convicted her. The only viable strategy was to argue mitigating circumstances: her horrific childhood, her history of abuse, her mental health issues, and to hope that a jury would choose life in prison over execution. But that strategy would require Aileen's cooperation, and Aileen was volatile, unpredictable, and increasingly convinced that the legal system was rigged against her. She distrusted her attorneys, changed her story repeatedly, and oscillated between claiming self defense and accepting her guilt. She was her own worst enemy, and her attorneys knew it. The rain continued to fall on Daytona Beach through that January, washing over the highways where 7 men had died, over the motels where Aileen had lived, over the jail where she now sat. It fell on the news cameras and the reporters, on the protesters who had already begun to gather, some demanding justice for the victims, others arguing against the death penalty, all of them using Aileen Wuornos as a symbol for their own causes. And in her cell, Aileen sat alone, trying to understand how she had arrived at this moment, how the trajectory of her life had led from a childhood of abuse to death row. She thought about the question that no one had ever asked her, the question that might have changed everything. What do you need? What would it take to save you? But no one was asking now. The time for saving had passed, if it had ever existed at all. Now there was only justice, or what passed for justice in a system that had failed her at every turn. Now there was only the trial, the verdict, the sentence, the long walk toward an ending that seemed as inevitable as it was unjust. The net had closed completely. The wire had captured her confession. The betrayal was complete, and Aileen Carol Wuornos, who had spent her entire life trying to survive, was about to discover that survival was no longer an option. There is a moment in every trial when the defendant becomes real to the jury, when they stop being an abstract concept, the accused, the alleged killer, and become a person sitting feet away, breathing the same air, occupying the same space. For Aileen Wuornos, that moment came early in her first trial during the opening statements, when she shifted in her chair and the chains connecting her wrist and ankle shackles rattled against the metal legs of the defense table. The sound was sharp and sudden in the silent courtroom, and every juror turned to look at her. She looked back, her eyes meeting theirs, and in that exchange was the fundamental question that would define the proceedings. Was she a victim who had killed to survive, or was she a predator who had murdered for profit? The state of Florida versus Aileen Carol Wuornos formally began on January 13th, 1992, 13 months after her arrest, in the Volusia County Courthouse in DeLand, Florida. The courtroom was a relic of mid century civic architecture, all wood paneling and high ceilings designed to convey the weight and dignity of the law. The benches were hard, the air conditioning inadequate, the fluorescent lighting harsh and unforgiving. Judge Uriel Blount Jr. presided, a veteran jurist known for his no nonsense approach and his strict adherence to procedure. The decision had been made to try Aileen first for the murder of Richard Charles Mallory. Of the seven victims, Mallory's case was the strongest from a prosecutorial standpoint. His body had been found relatively quickly, the forensic evidence was substantial, and Aileen had confessed to his murder in detail. The prosecution believed that securing a conviction in the Mallory case would make the subsequent trials, if they were necessary, easier to win. Florida law allowed for separate trials for each murder, and theoretically, Aileen faced six individual trials corresponding to the six victims whose bodies had been recovered: Mallory, David Spears, Charles Carskadden, Troy Burris, Dick Humphreys, and Walter Antonio. The Peter Seams case remained uncharged due to the absence of a body, though evidence of his murder would be introduced in later proceedings as similar fact evidence, a legal mechanism that allowed prosecutors to demonstrate a pattern of behavior. But the reality of multiple capital trials was complex and expensive. Each trial required jury selection, witness testimony, forensic presentations, and the extensive appeals process that accompanied death penalty cases. The state attorney's office recognized that a conviction and death sentence in the Mallory trial might obviate the need for subsequent trials, or at least provide leverage for plea negotiations in the remaining cases. The defense team representing Aileen consisted of two public defenders, William Miller and Tricia Jenkins, both experienced capital defense attorneys from the Office of Regional Conflict Counsel. Miller was the lead attorney, a man in his 40s with a quiet, methodical approach to trial work. Jenkins was younger, more aggressive, tasked with cross examination and jury persuasion. They had been appointed to the case shortly after Aileen's arrest and had spent the intervening year preparing a defense that they knew faced nearly insurmountable odds. Their client was her own worst enemy. Aileen had confessed to all the murders in recorded interrogations. She had provided details that only the killer could know. She had admitted to taking the victim's property and vehicles. The forensic evidence corroborated her confessions: ballistics, fingerprints, pawn shop records, witness testimony. From a purely legal standpoint, the case was already lost before it began. The only viable defense strategy was to argue that the killings had been committed in self defense, that Aileen had reasonably believed her life was in danger when she shot the men. Florida law recognized self defense as a complete justification for homicide, even in cases where the defendant had initiated contact with the victim, as long as the defendant could demonstrate a reasonable fear of imminent death or great bodily harm. But self defense in the context of seven separate killings, all following the same pattern, was a difficult argument to sustain. It required the jury to believe that Aileen had, through extraordinary bad luck, or because of some pattern of victimization, been attacked or threatened by every single man she encountered. It required them to overlook the fact that she had robbed each victim, had taken their cars, had pawned their possessions. It required them to see her not as a serial killer, but as a serial victim. Miller and Jenkins knew this was a long shot, but they also knew that Aileen's life story, the childhood abuse, the rape, the exploitation, the complete absence of any support or intervention, created a context for her violence that a sympathetic jury might find mitigating, if not exculpatory. Their goal was not necessarily acquittal, which seemed impossible, but a sentence of life in prison rather than death. The prosecution team was led by Assistant State Attorney John Tanner, a seasoned prosecutor in his 50s with a reputation for methodical, evidence driven trial strategy. Assisting him was David Damore, younger and more theatrical, responsible for the emotional appeals and victim impact portions of the case. Together, they presented a formidable team, well resourced and highly motivated to secure not just a conviction, but a death sentence. Their strategy was straightforward: present the forensic evidence, present the confession, present the testimony of Tyria Moore, and let the facts speak for themselves. They would argue that Aileen was a cold blooded killer who had murdered for financial gain, that the self defense claims were fabrications designed to justify robbery and murder, and that she posed an ongoing danger to society that could only be neutralized through execution. Jury selection began on January 6, 1992, and took nearly a week. The process of selecting a jury for a capital case is painstaking and often surreal. Potential jurors are questioned not just about their ability to be fair and impartial, but about their willingness to impose the death penalty if the evidence warrants it. Those who express categorical opposition to capital punishment are dismissed for cause, a process that systematically excludes the most mercy inclined members of the community and produces what critics call a death qualified jury, one predisposed to convict and sentence harshly. The jury pool in Volusia County was drawn from a predominantly white, working class population. Many potential jurors had already formed opinions about the case based on the extensive media coverage. The composite sketches, the arrest, the confessions, all of it had been front page news for over a year. During voir dire, the process of questioning potential jurors, both the prosecution and defense probed for bias. "Have you heard about this case?" Tanner asked each potential juror. Nearly all of them had. "Have you formed an opinion about the guilt or innocence of the defendant?" Many admitted they had, and those who could not convince the judge they could set aside their preconceptions were dismissed. "Could you, if the evidence supports it, vote to impose the death penalty?" Tanner asked. Some said yes, without hesitation. Others struggled with the question, admitted ambivalence, and were either challenged for cause or peremptorily struck by the defense. Miller and Jenkins, for their part, looked for jurors who might be sympathetic to Aileen's background, who might understand that trauma and abuse could shape a person's capacity for violence. They asked about experiences with domestic violence, with addiction, with poverty. They looked for women, hoping that female jurors might identify with Aileen's experiences of sexual victimization, but the death qualification process winnowed the jury pool toward those most likely to convict and sentence harshly. The final jury consisted of 12 members, 8 men and 4 women, all white, ranging in age from their 30s to their 60s. Most were working class: factory workers, clerks, retirees. None had college degrees. None had significant experience with the criminal justice system beyond serving on juries. They were, in demographic terms, a jury of Aileen's peers, though the gulf between their life experiences and hers was vast and unbridgeable. The trial itself began on Monday, January 13th, with opening statements. The courtroom was packed. The front rows were reserved for the families of the victims. Richard Mallory's sister and a few close friends had made the trip from Clearwater. Behind them sat reporters from every major news organization in Florida and several national outlets. Sketch artists sat with pads and charcoal, capturing the scene for television broadcasts and newspapers. The back rows were filled with members of the public who had lined up before dawn to secure seats, drawn by morbid curiosity and the spectacle of a female serial killer on trial. Aileen sat at the defense table between Miller and Jenkins, dressed in clothes they had provided, a conservative blouse and slacks, an attempt to make her appear respectable and sympathetic. Her hair had been cut and styled. Her face, without the harsh makeup she usually wore, looked younger but also more vulnerable. The chains on her wrists and ankles were hidden beneath the table, but everyone knew they were there. She looked directly at the jury as they filed in, making eye contact with each of them in turn, her expression defiant and searching. What did they see when they looked at her? A killer, a victim, a woman, a monster? She would never know. Judge Blount called the court to order, and John Tanner rose to deliver the prosecution's opening statement. He was a tall man, gray haired and commanding, and he spoke with the calm authority of someone who knew the facts were on his side. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he began, this case is about murder, premeditated, cold blooded murder committed not once, but 7 times. The defendant, Aileen Carol Wuornos, lured men to isolated locations under the pretense of providing sexual services, and then when those men were vulnerable and unarmed, she shot them. She shot them multiple times. She robbed them. She stole their vehicles, and she left their bodies in the woods to rot. Tanner walked the jury through the basic facts of the Mallory case. He described Richard Mallory as a small business owner, a man who made the mistake of picking up the defendant on November 30th, 1989. He described the discovery of Mallory's body in the woods near Ormond Beach, the 4 gunshot wounds, the theft of his Cadillac, and personal belongings. The evidence in this case is overwhelming, Tanner said. We have the defendant's fingerprints in the victim's car. We have her confession, recorded on tape, in which she admits to killing Mr. Mallory. We have ballistic evidence showing that the bullets recovered from Mr. Mallory's body were fired from the same gun that killed 5 other men. We have pawnshop records showing the defendant selling Mr. Mallory's property just days after his death. He paused, letting the weight of the evidence settle over the jury. The defendant will claim self defense, he continued. She will tell you that Mr. Mallory attacked her, that she feared for her life, that she had no choice but to shoot him. But the evidence will show that this claim is a lie. Mr. Mallory was shot in the back. He was shot 4 times, repeatedly, even after he was already dying. This was not self defense. This was execution. This was murder for money. Tanner sat down, and the courtroom was silent for a moment before Judge Blount turned to the defense. Mr. Miller, your opening statement. William Miller stood slowly. He was shorter than Tanner, less physically imposing, but there was a gravity to his presence. He walked to the jury box and stood close to the rail, speaking quietly, forcing the jurors to lean in to hear him. Members of the jury, he began, this case is not as simple as the prosecution would have you believe. Yes, Aileen Wuornos killed Richard Mallory. She has admitted that. But the question before you is not whether she killed him. The question is why. And the answer to that question requires you to understand who Aileen Wuornos is and what her life has been. Miller spoke about Aileen's childhood, the abuse, the abandonment, the rape. He described her life on the streets, the years of prostitution, the constant violence she endured from the men who paid for her body. For 33 years, he said, Aileen Wuornos has been a victim. She was victimized as a child by her grandfather. She was victimized as a teenager by the men who raped her. She was victimized as an adult by the Johns who beat her, who robbed her, who threatened her life. And on November 30th, 1989, Richard Mallory became one more man who tried to victimize her. He described Aileen's account of the encounter with Mallory, her claim that he had raped her, tied her up, threatened to kill her. He acknowledged the inconsistencies in her story, but argued that these were the result of trauma, not fabrication. When someone is fighting for their life, he said, when they are being raped and brutalized, they do not form clear linear memories. They survive, they react, and that is what Aileen did. She survived. Miller sat down, and the trial moved to the presentation of evidence. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. Over the course of 5 days, Tanner and Daymore presented a cascade of evidence that painted an irrefutable picture of Aileen's guilt. First came the forensic evidence. Dr. Arthur Botting, the medical examiner who had performed the autopsy on Richard Mallory, took the stand. He was a precise clinical witness, describing the four gunshot wounds in technical detail. The first bullet entered the victim's left forearm, fracturing the ulna, he testified. The second entered the left side of the chest, perforating the left lung. The third entered the right side of the chest, causing damage to the right lung and nicking the pericardium, the sac surrounding the heart. The fourth entered the left side of the neck, severing the jugular vein. Which wound caused death? Tanner asked. The neck wound was likely fatal within minutes due to exsanguination, Botting said. However, the chest wounds were also potentially fatal and would have caused death within a longer time frame, possibly hours if untreated. Can you describe the trajectory of the wounds? Tanner asked. The wounds entered from the left side, Botting said. The angles suggest the shooter was positioned to the victim's left, possibly at a slight elevation. Is the pattern of wounds consistent with self defense? Tanner asked. Spotting paused, choosing his words carefully. In my professional opinion, the pattern is more consistent with the victim being stationary or moving away from the shooter rather than advancing aggressively. Miller cross examined, attempting to create doubt. Dr. Botting, is it possible that Mr. Mallory was advancing toward Ms. Wuornos when he was shot? It is possible, Botting admitted. I cannot definitively rule out that scenario based solely on the wound patterns. And the multiple shots, could that be consistent with someone in a panic, someone who feared for their life? It could be, Botting said. The cross examination was competent but ineffective. The damage had been done. The jury had seen the autopsy photos, had heard the clinical description of Mallory's death, and the image of a man shot 4 times while trying to escape or while already dying was difficult to reconcile with self defense. Next came the ballistics expert, James Hatcher from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement Crime Laboratory. Hatcher had examined the bullets recovered from Richard Mallory's body and compared them to bullets recovered from the other victims. His testimony was technical, involving microscopic analysis of rifling marks and striations, but his conclusions were clear. The bullets recovered from Richard Mallory, David Spears, Charles Carskadden, Troy Burris, Charles Humphreys, and Walter Antonio were all fired from the same weapon, he testified, a 22 caliber handgun. How certain are you of this conclusion? Tanner asked. I am certain to a scientific degree of probability, Hatcher said. The rifling characteristics are identical. The lands and grooves, the twist rate, the individual striations, they all match. These bullets came from the same gun. This testimony was crucial because it linked all the murders, establishing a pattern that undermined any claim of isolated self defense. If Aileen had been attacked once and defended herself, that might be believable. But being attacked 7 times by 7 different men in 7 different locations, all requiring deadly force, the pattern suggested predation, not victimization. The fingerprint evidence was presented by forensic technician Carol Roberts. She testified that Aileen's fingerprints had been found on the steering wheel, door handle, and rearview mirror of Richard Mallory's Cadillac. Tyria Moore's fingerprints had also been found in the car on the passenger side door and dashboard. Miller's cross examination attempted to suggest innocent explanations. Is it possible that Ms. Warnos's fingerprints got into the car because Mr. Mallory gave her a ride before any violence occurred? It is possible, Roberts admitted. Fingerprints can't tell us when they were deposited or under what circumstances, but the cumulative weight of the evidence made innocent explanations increasingly implausible. The pawn shop evidence was introduced through the testimony of John Dunn, a clerk at the Volusia Pawn Shop in Daytona Beach. Dunn identified Aileen from photographs and from seeing her in the courtroom. Do you recognize the defendant? Tanner asked. Yes, Dunn said. She came into the pawn shop on December 6th, 1989. She pawned a camera and a radar detector. How do you remember the specific date? Tanner asked. We keep detailed records, Dunn said. Every pawn transaction requires the seller to provide identification and a thumbprint. I pulled the records for that date when the police contacted me. The pawn slip was entered into evidence, showing the name Susan Blahovec, an address in Daytona Beach, and a thumbprint that had been matched to Aileen. The camera and radar detector were later identified by Mallory's family as belonging to him. Miller cross examined briefly, but there was little to challenge. The pawnshop records were meticulous, and the thumbprint was definitive. The most damaging evidence, however, was yet to come: Aileen's own confession. On the sixth day of trial, the prosecution played the audio recordings of Aileen's interrogation. The courtroom fell silent as Aileen's voice filled the space, her words captured on tape months earlier, confessing to the murder of Richard Mallory and the others. The jury listened to her describe the encounter with Mallory, her voice sometimes defiant, sometimes weary, always searching for understanding that would not come. He picked me up on the highway, her recorded voice said. We agreed on a price, $50. We drove to this wooded area off John Anderson Drive, and then he got rough. He started hitting me, tearing my clothes. He said he was going to fuck me and then kill me. So I grabbed my gun and I shot him. The recording continued, Aileen's voice describing the shooting in detail, the panic, the gun in her hand, the sound of the shots, Mallory's body slumping in the seat. She described taking his wallet, his keys, driving away in his car. I was scared, her voice said on the tape. I thought the cops would think I murdered him. I thought nobody would believe me. When the tape ended, the silence in the courtroom was profound. The jurors sat motionless, absorbing what they had heard. Aileen, sitting at the defense table, stared down at her hands, her face expressionless. Miller had objected to the admission of the confession before trial, arguing that Aileen had been coerced, that she had not fully understood her rights when she waived her attorney, that the interrogation had been designed to manipulate her into confessing. Judge Blount had ruled against him, finding that Aileen had been properly Mirandized and that her waiver of counsel had been knowing and voluntary. Now, with the confession played for the jury, Miller faced the nearly impossible task of explaining it away. During his cross examination of the interrogating officer, he tried to highlight the coercive aspects of the interrogation. Detective Munster, did you tell Ms. Wuornos that confessing would help her? We told her that cooperation is always considered favorably, Munster said. Did you tell her that if she confessed, she might avoid the death penalty? We discussed the possibility of a plea agreement, Munster admitted, but we made no promises. Did you emphasize to her that this was her opportunity to tell her side of the story, to make people understand what happened? Yes, Munster said. We wanted to hear her account. And in telling that account, she consistently maintained that she acted in self defense, that she feared for her life. She made that claim. Yes, Munster said, but the physical evidence does not support it. The cross examination was effective in highlighting Aileen's self defense narrative, but it could not erase the fact that she had confessed to killing Richard Mallory and taking his possessions. The confession was devastating, and both sides knew it. As the prosecution's case drew to a close, the final and most anticipated witness was called Tyria Jolene Moore. Tyria entered the courtroom through a side door, accompanied by a bailiff. She was dressed conservatively in a dark skirt and blouse, her hair pulled back, her face pale and drawn. She had lost weight since Aileen had last seen her, and she looked younger, more fragile. She walked to the witness stand without looking at Aileen, though everyone in the courtroom could feel the weight of their shared history in the space between them. Aileen, sitting at the defense table, leaned forward as Tyria entered. Her eyes followed Tyria's every movement, her expression cycling through emotions: hope, love, betrayal, rage, in rapid succession. She had not seen Tyria since January of 1991, since the day Tyria had left the motel and disappeared. She had not heard her voice except through the recorded phone calls that had been used to elicit her confession. Tyria was sworn in, her hand trembling slightly as she placed it on the Bible. She sat down in the witness chair and kept her eyes fixed on the prosecutor, refusing to look at Aileen. John Tanner approached the witness stand, his manner gentle, almost protective. "Please state your name for the record," he said. "Tyria Jolene Moore," she said quietly. "Ms. Moore, I know this is difficult for you," Tanner said. "I appreciate your being here today. Can you tell the jury how you know the defendant, Aileen Wuornos?" Tyria took a breath, steadying herself. "I was her girlfriend," she said. "We lived together for about 4 years." "Can you describe the nature of your relationship?" Tanner asked. "We were lovers," Tyria said. "We were in a romantic relationship. I loved her." The admission hung in the air, and Aileen's eyes filled with tears. She had not heard Tyria say those words in over a year, and despite everything, the betrayal, the recorded phone calls, the immunity deal, she still wanted to believe they were true. "Did Ms. Warno support you financially?" Tanner asked. "Yes," Tyria said. "I worked sometimes, cleaning hotel rooms, but Lee made most of the money." "How did she make money?" Tanner asked. Tyria hesitated, then answered quietly. "She worked as a prostitute. She would hitchhike along the highways and have sex with men for money." "Were you aware of this?" Tanner asked. "Yes," Tyria said. "I knew what she did. Did you approve of it?" Tanner asked. Tyria shook her head. "I hated it. I hated that she had to do that. But we needed the money." "Did Ms. Warnos ever tell you about the men she encountered while working?" Tanner asked. "Sometimes," Tyria said. "She would come home and tell me about clients who had been mean or rough. She said a lot of them tried to hurt her." "Did she ever tell you she had killed anyone?" Tanner asked. Tyria's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Not at first," she said. "When did she tell you?" Tanner asked. Tyria looked down at her hands, gripping the edge of the witness stand. "It was later," she said, "after the police released those composite sketches. I saw them on TV and I knew it was us. I confronted Lee and she told me she had killed people. She said they had tried to rape her, that she had to defend herself." "Did you believe her?" Tanner asked. "I wanted to believe her," Tyria said, and her voice broke slightly. "I loved her. I didn't want to think she would lie to me about something like that." "But did you believe her?" Tanner pressed. Tyria finally looked up, and for the first time, her eyes met Aileen's across the courtroom. The moment was electric, charged with everything unspoken between them: the love, the betrayal, the fear, the grief. "I don't know," Tyria said quietly. "I don't know what I believed." Tanner walked Tyria through the phone calls, the ones she had made from the police station in Pennsylvania. He played excerpts from the recordings, and the courtroom heard Tyria's voice, frightened and pleading, telling Aileen she was scared of being charged, begging her to confess to protect Tyria from prosecution. When the recording ended, Tanner asked, "Ms. Moore, why did you make those phone calls?" The police told me I would be charged as an accessory if I didn't cooperate, Tyria said. They told me Lee was going to turn on me, that she would say I was involved. I was scared. I didn't want to go to prison. Did you know that the calls were being recorded? Tanner asked. Yes, Tyria said. The police were listening. They told me what to say. Did you lie to Miss Wuornos during those calls? Tanner asked. Tyria's face crumpled, tears streaming down her cheeks. I told her I loved her, she said. And I did. I do. But I also told her things to make her confess, things the police wanted me to say. So, yes, I lied. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of Tyria crying. Aileen sat frozen at the defense table, tears running down her own face, her hands clenched into fists. William Miller cross examined Tyria, attempting to portray her as a willing participant in Aileen's crimes, someone who had benefited from the murders and then saved herself by betraying Aileen. Ms. Moore, you benefited financially from the murders, didn't you? Miller asked. Tyria looked at him, her eyes red and swollen. I didn't know they were murders, she said. I thought the money came from prostitution. But you lived off that money, Miller said. You let Aileen pay for your food, your shelter, your cigarettes, all with money and possessions taken from dead men. I didn't know, Tyria repeated, her voice rising. Lee never told me. She kept it from me. Did she? Miller asked. You saw her come home with cars that didn't belong to her. You saw her with wallets, cameras, other people's belongings. You never asked where they came from? I didn't want to know, Tyria said. I should have asked. I should have done something, but I didn't. And I have to live with that. You have to live with it, Miller said. But you don't have to go to prison for it, do you? Because you made a deal, immunity in exchange for your testimony against the woman you claim to love. Tyria looked at Aileen then, directly, and her voice was steady despite the tears. I do love her, she said. I will always love her. But I couldn't go to prison for something I didn't do. I couldn't die for her. Aileen stood up suddenly at the defense table, her chains rattling, her voice breaking the decorum of the courtroom. Ty, please, she shouted. Please don't do this. Judge Blount banged his gavel. Ms. Wuornos, sit down. Counsel, control your client. Miller and Jenkins pulled Aileen back into her seat, but she continued to stare at Tyria, her face contorted with grief and rage. Ty, I love you, she said, quieter now, but still audible throughout the courtroom. I did this for you. I killed them to keep us together. Tyria sobbed openly now, shaking her head. I didn't ask you to do that, she said. I never asked you to kill anyone. The judge ordered a recess, and Tyria was escorted out of the courtroom, still crying. Aileen was led away by bailiffs, her chains clanking, her voice echoing in the hallway as she called Tyria's name. When the trial resumed an hour later, Tyria was gone, her testimony complete. She had been driven out of the county, back into protective anonymity, her immunity deal intact. She would never see Aileen again. The emotional crucible of Tyria's testimony had been everything the prosecution hoped for and everything the defense feared. The jury had seen the woman Aileen loved, the woman she had killed for, betray her on the witness stand. They had seen Aileen's desperate love, her claim that the murders were committed to provide for Tyria, and they had seen Tyria deny responsibility, deny knowledge, deny everything except the love that she still claimed to feel. The testimony was devastating because it humanized Aileen even as it condemned her. The jury saw not a monster, but a woman who loved desperately, who killed to keep that love from leaving, who was now being destroyed by the very person she had tried to protect. But the testimony also confirmed the prosecution's narrative that Aileen had killed for money, that she had used that money to support herself and Tyria, and that the self defense claims were fabrications designed to justify robbery and murder. The trial moved toward its conclusion. The defense called its own witnesses. Psychologists who testified about Aileen's traumatic childhood, about the effects of long term abuse on the developing brain, about PTSD and survival mechanisms. They called character witnesses who described Aileen as a troubled woman, but not an evil one, someone who had been failed by every system meant to protect her. But the defense did not call Aileen herself to testify. Miller and Jenkins advised against it, knowing that Aileen was volatile, that her testimony could backfire catastrophically, that the prosecution would eviscerate her on cross examination. Aileen wanted to testify, wanted to tell her story in her own words, but her attorneys convinced her that silence was her best option. The closing arguments were delivered on January 20th. Tanner spoke for the prosecution, summarizing the evidence, emphasizing the premeditation and the profit motive, arguing that Aileen Wuornos was a serial killer who deserved the ultimate penalty. She is a predator, he told the jury. She lured men to their deaths. She executed them, and she would have continued killing if she had not been stopped. Miller spoke for the defense, his voice quiet and earnest, asking the jury to see Aileen as a human being, to understand the context of her violence, to choose mercy over vengeance. She has lived a life of unimaginable pain, he said. And yes, she killed, but she killed to survive in a world that had shown her nothing but cruelty. Do not add to that cruelty by taking her life. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. On January 27th, 1992, they returned a verdict guilty of first degree murder. Aileen showed no reaction when the verdict was read. She sat motionless, staring at the jury, her face blank. But inside, something broke, some final thread of hope that had been holding her together. She was guilty, she was a murderer, and the world had decided that she deserved to die. The penalty phase of the trial would determine whether she would spend the rest of her life in prison or be sentenced to death. And as the courtroom emptied and Aileen was led back to her cell, the rain began to fall outside, drumming on the roof of the courthouse, washing over the streets of DeLand, falling on the highways where 7 men had died and where the drowning moon hung heavy, waiting for the final judgment. The penalty phase of a capital trial is where the law attempts to reconcile the irreconcilable, the precise language of statutes, and the immeasurable weight of a human life. In Florida, as in most death penalty states, the penalty phase is a separate proceeding that follows a guilty verdict in a capital case. The same jury that convicted the defendant must now decide whether that defendant should live or die. They are asked to weigh aggravating factors, circumstances that make the crime more heinous and deserving of death, against mitigating factors, circumstances that might inspire mercy and justify life imprisonment instead. For Aileen Wuornos, the penalty phase of her trial for the murder of Richard Mallory began on January 28th, 1992, the day after her conviction. The courtroom was the same, the players were the same, but the atmosphere had shifted. The question was no longer whether she had killed, but whether she should die for it. The prosecution presented its case for death with clinical efficiency. John Tanner called witnesses to establish the aggravating factors required under Florida law. The first factor was that the murder had been committed during the course of a robbery. Tanner introduced the pawnshop records again, the evidence showing that Aileen had taken Richard Mallory's camera, radar detector, and money, and had sold his possessions within days of his death. The robbery, Tanner argued, was not incidental to the murder, but its motivating purpose. The second aggravating factor was that the murder had been especially heinous, atrocious, or cruel. Dr. Botting returned to the stand to describe Mallory's death in greater detail, explaining that the gunshot wounds would have caused excruciating pain, that Mallory would have remained conscious for several minutes as he bled out, that his final moments would have been filled with terror and agony. The third aggravating factor was Aileen's prior criminal history. Tanner introduced records of her previous arrests and convictions, assault, armed robbery, weapons offenses, forgery. He argued that Aileen had demonstrated a pattern of violence and criminality that predated the murders and would continue if she were allowed to live. The most powerful aggravating evidence, however, came in the form of what Florida law called similar fact evidence, proof that Aileen had committed other crimes following the same pattern as the Mallory murder. Tanner introduced evidence of the six other killings: David Spears, Charles Carskadden, Troy Burris, Dick Humphreys, Walter Antonio, and the disappearance of Peter Seams. He presented the ballistics evidence showing that all the victims had been shot with the same gun. He presented the timeline, demonstrating that the murders had occurred over the course of 13 months, a sustained killing spree rather than an isolated incident. This evidence was devastating because it transformed Aileen from someone who had killed once in a moment of panic or self defense into a serial killer who had murdered repeatedly, methodically, for profit. The jury was being asked to see not just the murder of Richard Mallory, but the murder of seven men, a pattern of predation that could only be stopped by execution. The defense presented its case for life with the only weapons it had: Aileen's humanity and her suffering. William Miller called Dr. Elizabeth McMahon, a psychologist who had evaluated Aileen extensively in the months since her arrest. Dr. McMahon was a specialist in trauma and abuse, and her testimony was designed to help the jury understand how Aileen's childhood had shaped her capacity for violence. Ms. Wuornos suffered severe and chronic abuse throughout her developmental years, Dr. McMahon testified. She was physically beaten by her grandfather on a regular basis. She was sexually exploited from a very young age, engaged in prostitution as a child. She gave birth at 14 to a baby who was immediately taken from her. She was homeless at 15. These experiences caused profound psychological damage. What kind of damage? Miller asked. Dr. McMahon described a constellation of disorders: post traumatic stress disorder, borderline personality disorder, antisocial traits, chronic depression, substance abuse. She explained that Aileen's brain had developed in an environment of constant threat, that her nervous system had been conditioned to perceive danger everywhere, that her capacity for trust and healthy relationships had been destroyed before she even reached adulthood. People who experience this level of trauma, Dr. McMahon said, often develop what we call a trauma response pattern. They see the world as fundamentally hostile. They believe that violence is inevitable and that the only way to survive is to strike first. This doesn't excuse Ms. Warnos's actions, but it helps explain them. The testimony was compelling, but Tanner's cross examination was brutal. Dr. McMahon, how many people suffer childhood abuse in this country? He asked. Millions, Dr. McMahon admitted. And how many of those people become serial killers? Tanner asked. A very small percentage, Dr. McMahon said. So abuse doesn't cause serial killing, does it? Tanner pressed. Not directly, no, Dr. McMahon said, but it creates vulnerabilities, predispositions, and millions of people overcome those vulnerabilities without killing anyone, don't they? Tanner interrupted. Yes, Dr. McMahon said quietly. The point was made. Aileen's suffering was real, but it was not unique, and it did not justify or explain seven murders. Miller also called character witnesses, people who had known Aileen at various points in her life and could testify to her capacity for kindness, for loyalty, for love. A former neighbor from Michigan described Aileen as a protective older sister to her brother Keith, someone who had tried to shield him from their grandfather's violence. A woman who had worked alongside Aileen cleaning hotel rooms in the mid-80s described her as hardworking and funny, someone who made the brutal work of scrubbing toilets and changing sheets bearable. But these testimonies felt thin, insufficient against the weight of seven dead men. The jury listened politely, but their expressions suggested they had already made their decision. The victim impact statements came next, and they were shattering. Richard Mallory's sister took the stand, a woman in her 60s with graying hair and eyes reddened from crying. She spoke directly to the jury, her voice shaking but determined. "My brother was not a perfect man," she said, "but he was my brother. He was someone's son, someone's uncle. He ran a business. He helped people fix their electronics so they didn't have to buy new ones. He was just trying to live his life, and she took that away from him. She took him away from us." She described the agony of not knowing where Richard was for 2 weeks, the hope that maybe he had just gone on a trip and forgotten to call, the devastating phone call from police telling her his body had been found. She described the funeral, the closed casket because decomposition had made viewing impossible, the grief that had consumed their family. "We will never recover from this," she said. "There is a hole in our family that can never be filled, and if you let her live, that hole will just keep getting bigger, knowing that the person who did this is still alive when Richard is not." The testimony was emotionally overwhelming, and several jurors were crying by the time she finished. Aileen sat at the defense table, staring down at her hands, her face expressionless. Whether she felt remorse, whether the sister's words penetrated the armor she had built around herself, was impossible to know. The closing arguments in the penalty phase were brief. Tanner argued that Aileen was a dangerous predator who would kill again if given the opportunity, that the aggravating factors far outweighed any mitigation, that justice for the victims and protection for society required the death penalty. Miller argued that executing Aileen would not bring the victims back, that her life, however damaged and destructive, still had value, that mercy was not weakness, but the highest expression of our humanity. The jury deliberated for 90 minutes. On January 27th, 1992, they returned with their recommendation: death. Under Florida law at the time, the jury's recommendation was advisory only. The final sentencing decision rested with the judge. But juries rarely recommended death, and judges rarely overruled them when they did. Judge Blount scheduled the formal sentencing hearing for March 31st, giving himself time to review the evidence and the jury's findings. In the intervening weeks, Aileen remained in the Volusia County Jail, isolated from other inmates, watched constantly to prevent suicide. She was numb, unable to fully process what had happened. She had been convicted. The jury had recommended death. Tyria had betrayed her. Everything she had fought for, everything she had killed for, had come to nothing. On March 31st, 1992, Judge Blount held the sentencing hearing. Aileen was brought into the courtroom in full restraints, her wrists and ankles shackled, a chain around her waist. She looked thinner than she had during the trial, her face gaunt, her eyes hollow. Judge Blount read his decision from the bench, his voice formal and measured. He had reviewed the aggravating and mitigating factors, had considered the jury's recommendation, had examined the evidence. He found that the aggravating factors, the murder during a robbery, the heinous nature of the crime, the pattern of violence, substantially outweighed the mitigating factors. He adopted the jury's recommendation. Aileen Carol Wuornos, Judge Blount said, "It is the judgment and sentence of this court that you be delivered to the Florida Department of Corrections for confinement on death row, and that at a time to be determined by the governor of Florida you shall be put to death by electrocution." Aileen showed no reaction. She had known this was coming. The only surprise was that she felt nothing, no fear, no rage, just a vast emptiness. She was transferred to the Broward Correctional Institution in Pembroke Pines, Florida, the state's death row facility for women. She arrived in April of 1992, processed through intake, given a prison uniform, assigned a cell. Death row at Broward was a small unit, housing fewer than a dozen women at any given time, all of them awaiting execution. The cells were 6 by 9 feet, concrete walls painted pale yellow, a metal bunk, a toilet, a sink. Aileen would spend 23 hours a day in this cell for the next 10 years. The remaining trials were resolved quickly. Facing the certainty of additional death sentences and the exhaustion of fighting cases she could not win, Aileen accepted plea deals for the murders of David Spears, Charles Carskadden, and Troy Burris. She pleaded no contest to 3 counts of first degree murder in exchange for sentences of life imprisonment to run concurrently with her death sentence. The distinction was academic. She was already sentenced to die, but it closed the cases and spared the families the trauma of additional trials. For the murders of Dick Humphreys and Walter Antonio, separate trials were held, both in Marion County. Aileen represented herself in these trials, having fired her public defenders in fits of rage and paranoia, convinced they were conspiring against her. The trials were brief and chaotic, Aileen alternating between defiant self justification and tearful breakdowns. She was convicted in both cases and sentenced to death twice more. By the end of 1992, Aileen Wuornos had 3 death sentences and 3 life sentences, a legal redundancy that nonetheless underscored the magnitude of her crimes. Life on death row is a peculiar form of torture. The condemned live in a state of suspended animation, waiting for an execution date that may come in months or decades, subject to the glacial pace of the appeals process. For Aileen, the isolation was both a relief and a torment. She was separated from the general population, protected from the violence and chaos of a regular prison, but also denied human contact, community, purpose. She spent her days reading, writing letters, watching the small television in her cell. She slept erratically, her nights haunted by nightmares of the men she had killed, of Tyria, of her grandfather, of all the ghosts that populated her past. She was allowed limited phone calls and visitors, though visitors were rare. Her family had disowned her completely. Tyria never contacted her. The only regular visitors were journalists, documentary filmmakers, and religious volunteers who saw her as a soul to be saved or a story to be told. The media spectacle surrounding Aileen Wuornos began before her conviction and intensified dramatically afterward. She was a sensation, a cultural phenomenon, America's first widely publicized female serial killer. The tabloids were obsessed with her, running headlines that were lurid and dehumanizing. Damsel of Death gets chair. Highway hooker's reign of terror ends. Lesbian killer sentenced to die. But the coverage extended far beyond tabloids. Serious news organizations, academic journals, feminist publications, and true crime writers all weighed in, trying to understand who Aileen Wuornos was and what her story meant. Some framed her as a victim of patriarchy, a woman pushed to violence by a lifetime of male brutality. Others framed her as a monster, proof that women were just as capable of evil as men. Still others saw her as mentally ill, a deeply damaged person who should have been hospitalized rather than executed. Documentaries began almost immediately. Filmmakers contacted Aileen in prison, offering money for interviews, for her story, for access to her life. She accepted many of these offers, desperate for attention, for money to put in her commissary account, for some sense that her life mattered to someone. The most significant of these documentaries was produced by British filmmaker Nick Broomfield, who made 2 films about Aileen. Aileen Wuornos, The Selling of a Serial Killer in 1992, and Aileen, Life and Death of a Serial Killer in 2003. Broomfield's films were critical of the media circus surrounding Aileen, but they also participated in it, turning her pain and her pathology into entertainment. In the first documentary, Broomfield interviewed Aileen extensively, and the footage revealed a woman who was simultaneously manipulative and vulnerable, defiant and desperate. She told contradictory stories about the murders, sometimes insisting they were self defense, other times admitting they were for money, sometimes claiming she enjoyed killing. I killed them because they deserved it, she said in one interview. They were rapists, every one of them. They were going to hurt me. But in another interview, her story changed. I killed them for the money, she said flatly. I needed money to survive, and they had it. That's the truth. The contradictions were partly strategic. Aileen was trying to control her narrative, to say whatever she thought would help her appeals or generate sympathy. But they were also a reflection of her fractured psyche, her inability to construct a coherent narrative of her own life. Broomfield also interviewed Arlene Prowla, a woman who had adopted Aileen as her adult daughter, while Aileen was on death row. Prowla was a born again Christian who had contacted Aileen after reading about her case, offering spiritual guidance and maternal love. Aileen, starved for affection and connection, had embraced the relationship, and Prowla had legally adopted her in 1991. But the relationship was complicated and exploitative. Prala sold interviews about Aileen, profited from book and movie deals, and positioned herself as Aileen's savior while simultaneously using her story for financial gain. Broomfield's documentary exposed this exploitation, showing Prala and her lawyer, Steve Glazer, negotiating movie rights and interview fees, treating Aileen as a commodity rather than a person. Aileen's relationship with Prala was emblematic of her time on death row. Every connection, every relationship, every interaction was transactional, exploitative, conditional. People wanted something from her, her story, her confession, her soul, and they offered love or money or attention in exchange. Aileen, who had spent her entire life in transactional relationships, did not know how to distinguish genuine care from manipulation. Her conversion to Christianity came during this period, facilitated by Prowl and the prison chaplains who visited death row. Aileen embraced the born again narrative with the same intensity she brought to everything else. She claimed to have been saved, to have accepted Jesus Christ as her personal Savior, to have repented of her sins. She spoke about her crimes in the language of Christian redemption, framing her violence as the work of the devil and her salvation as a miracle of grace. In letters to supporters, she wrote about her faith with conviction and desperation. I know I am a sinner, she wrote. I know I have done terrible things, but Jesus forgives all sins, even mine. I am washed in the blood of the Lamb. I am saved. The sincerity of this conversion is difficult to assess. For Aileen, religion offered what it has offered countless condemned prisoners: hope, community, a framework for understanding suffering, and the possibility of redemption beyond the walls of the prison. But it also offered strategic benefits. Death penalty juries and appeals courts were more sympathetic to defendants who demonstrated remorse and religious transformation. Aileen's faith did not last. Within a year, she had abandoned Christianity as completely as she had embraced it, declaring that the church was corrupt, that Prala was using her, that God had abandoned her just like everyone else. The cycle of belief and disillusionment was another manifestation of her borderline personality disorder, her pattern of idealization and devaluation, her inability to sustain stable beliefs or relationships. Her recantations of her confessions followed a similar pattern. In 1994, Aileen recanted all her admissions of guilt, claiming that she had been coerced by police, manipulated by her attorneys, and that the murders had all been self defense. She gave interviews insisting that every man she killed had raped her or tried to rape her, that she had acted to save her own life, that the criminal justice system had railroaded her because she was a woman, a prostitute, a lesbian, an outsider. I never murdered anyone, she said in one interview from prison. I defended myself. That's not murder, that's survival. These recantations were not credible. The forensic evidence, the ballistics, the trajectories of the wounds all contradicted her self defense claims, but they were emotionally true to Aileen's experience. She genuinely believed, or wanted to believe, that she was a victim. that the world had conspired against her, that her violence had been justified. The psychiatric evaluations conducted during her time on death row painted a complex and troubling picture. Dr. Elizabeth McMahon's initial diagnosis of PTSD, borderline personality disorder, and antisocial traits was confirmed and expanded by subsequent evaluations. Borderline personality disorder is characterized by instability in relationships, self image, and emotions. People with BPD often experience intense fear of abandonment, engage in impulsive and self destructive behaviors, and have difficulty regulating their emotions. They idealize people and then abruptly devalue them when they feel betrayed or disappointed. They have a fragmented sense of self, often feeling empty or unsure of who they are. All of these symptoms were evident in Aileen's behavior. Her relationship with Tyria had been marked by intense attachment and desperate fear of abandonment. Her impulsive decisions, marrying Lewis Fell after knowing him for weeks, killing 7 men over 13 months, repeatedly firing her attorneys, demonstrated poor impulse control and inability to consider consequences. Her shifting narratives about the murders, about her faith, about her identity, reflected a fragmented and unstable sense of self. Post traumatic stress disorder compounded these issues. Aileen's childhood and adult life had been filled with traumatic events: abuse, rape, abandonment, violence. Her nervous system had been conditioned to constant vigilance, to perceiving threats everywhere. The murders in this framework were not cold blooded executions, but panic responses, a traumatized person's attempt to neutralize perceived threats before those threats could materialize. Antisocial personality disorder, characterized by disregard for the rights of others, lack of empathy, and pattern of criminal behavior, was also present but more complicated. Aileen was capable of empathy. Her love for Tyria, her protectiveness toward her brother Keith, her kindness to the few people who showed her genuine care all demonstrated emotional capacity. But she also demonstrated callousness toward her victims, an ability to kill repeatedly without apparent remorse, and a lifetime of criminal behavior. The psychiatric consensus was that Aileen was severely mentally ill, that her disorders were the direct result of severe childhood trauma, and that she had never received adequate treatment. But mental illness under Florida law was not a bar to execution unless it rendered the defendant unable to understand the nature of the punishment or the reasons for it. Aileen understood. She was mentally ill, but she was not insane in the legal sense. Therefore, she could be executed. Her letters from death row, preserved in court records and personal collections, reveal a woman cycling through rage, desperation, loneliness, and resignation. She wrote to journalists, to supporters, to pen pals, to anyone who would write back. The letters were sometimes coherent and articulate, other times rambling and paranoid. She wrote about the conditions on death row, the food, the guards, the other women. She wrote about her case, her innocence or guilt, depending on her mood. She wrote about Tyria obsessively, professing love and hurling curses in alternating paragraphs. I still love her, she wrote in one letter. She was my everything. I would have done anything for her. I did do everything for her. And she betrayed me. She destroyed me, but I still love her. I will love her until the day I die. In another letter, written months later, the tone was different. Tyria is a liar and a coward, she wrote. She used me and then threw me away when it was convenient. She deserves to rot in hell. I hope she never has a moment of peace for what she did to me. The volatility extended to her relationships with her attorneys. Aileen cycled through multiple lawyers during her appeals, firing them in fits of rage, accusing them of incompetence or conspiracy, sometimes representing herself before reluctantly accepting new counsel. The attorneys who worked on her appeals faced an impossible task. Their client was guilty, the evidence was overwhelming, and Aileen herself undermined their efforts at every turn. One of her attorneys described working with Aileen as trying to save someone who was actively drowning while simultaneously fighting off the person trying to rescue them. She wanted to be saved, but she didn't trust anyone to save her, so she attacked the very people trying to help. The appeals process in death penalty cases is lengthy and complex, designed to ensure that every legal issue is thoroughly examined before an execution occurs. Aileen's appeals focused on several issues: the admissibility of her confessions, the competency of her trial counsel, the introduction of similar fact evidence, the constitutionality of Florida's death penalty statute, and her mental competency to be executed. Each appeal was denied. The Florida Supreme Court upheld her convictions and sentences. Federal courts declined to intervene. The legal system ground forward with bureaucratic inevitability, moving her closer to execution with each rejected appeal. The broader cultural conversation around Aileen Wuornos' case touched on fundamental questions about gender, empathy, and justice in American society. Why was a female serial killer so shocking? Why did the media and public react to Aileen with such fascination and horror? And what did the eagerness to execute her reveal about society's willingness to extend mercy? Feminist scholars argued that Aileen's case exposed the double standards applied to male and female violence. Male serial killers, they noted, were often afforded a degree of fascination, even admiration. Their intelligence analyzed, their childhoods examined, their pathology treated as a puzzle to be solved. Female killers, in contrast, were treated as aberrations, as violations of essential femininity, as monsters. Aileen's sexuality also played a role in her demonization. She was a lesbian, and in the early 1990s, homosexuality was still heavily stigmatized, especially in conservative areas like Central Florida. Her relationship with Tyria was treated in media coverage not as a love story gone wrong, but as evidence of moral depravity, as though her sexual orientation was connected to her capacity for violence. Her work as a prostitute further marginalized her. Sex workers exist at the bottom of society's hierarchy of sympathy. When they are murdered, their deaths are often treated as less significant, less worthy of investigation or justice. When they kill, they are afforded no understanding, no recognition that the violence they inflicted might be connected to the violence they endured. If Aileen had been a middle class white woman with no criminal record, would she have received the death penalty? If she had been a man who killed 7 women, would the public have been more or less sympathetic? These questions have no definitive answers, but they haunted the case and continue to haunt discussions of her legacy. Some anti death penalty advocates embraced Aileen as a symbol of the injustice of capital punishment, arguing that executing a severely mentally ill woman who had been brutalized her entire life was barbaric and accomplished nothing. Others, including victim advocacy groups, argued that sympathy for Aileen erased the humanity of the men she killed, that focusing on her suffering minimized the suffering of Richard Mallory, David Spears, Charles Carskadden, Troy Burris, Dick Humphreys, Walter Antonio, and Peter Seams. Both perspectives contain truth. Aileen was a victim and a victimizer. Her suffering was real and did not justify her crimes. The men she killed were human beings whose lives mattered, and some of them may have been abusive or threatening, but none of them deserved execution without trial. The criminal justice system failed everyone involved, failed to protect Aileen as a child, failed to rehabilitate her as an adult, failed to prevent the murders, and failed to offer anything resembling restorative justice for the victims' families. By the late 1990s, Aileen had exhausted most of her appeals. She remained on death row, but the legal process was winding down. She was in her 40s now, her body deteriorating from years of poor nutrition, substance abuse, and the stress of incarceration. She suffered from chronic health problems, dental issues, skin conditions, gastrointestinal problems that were inadequately treated by the prison medical system. Her mental state was also deteriorating. She became increasingly paranoid, convinced that the guards were poisoning her food, that cameras were watching her constantly, that there was a conspiracy to torture her psychologically before executing her. Some of this paranoia was rooted in reality. Death Row was a place designed to break people, and Aileen was being broken, but some of it reflected genuine psychological decline, a slide toward psychosis that her psychiatric medications could not halt. In 2001, Aileen made a decision that would seal her fate. She fired her attorneys and announced that she wanted to stop her appeals. She told the court that she was tired of living in a cage, that the appeals process was prolonging her suffering, that she wanted to die. Florida law allowed condemned prisoners to waive their appeals and volunteer for execution, but the courts were required to determine that the decision was competent and voluntary. Aileen underwent a competency evaluation, and despite her obvious mental illness, the psychiatrist concluded that she understood the nature of her decision and its consequences. She was, in the legal sense, competent to be executed. The decision to volunteer for execution was complex. Aileen was exhausted, mentally and physically. She had spent nearly 10 years in a 6 by 9 cell, waiting to die, and the waiting had become unbearable. She had no hope of freedom, no hope of redemption, no hope that anything would ever change. Death, she believed, would be a release. But her decision was also influenced by her borderline personality disorder, by her pattern of giving up when relationships ended or when she felt abandoned. The appeals process had become her last connection to the outside world, her last evidence that someone cared whether she lived or died. When she felt that connection fraying, when her attorneys seemed to lose faith in her case, she responded by severing the connection herself, by choosing death as the ultimate abandonment. "I'm tired," she said in a court hearing. "I've been on death row for 10 years. I'm sick. I'm done. Just let me die." The judge granted her request. An execution date was set, October 9th, 2002. In the final months of her life, Aileen gave a series of interviews that were disturbing and revealing. She spoke with increasing paranoia and incoherence, claiming that she was being tortured by sonic pressure devices, that the state was conducting mind control experiments on her, that the guards were in league with a conspiracy that extended to the highest levels of government. These claims were dismissed as delusions, and they may have been, but they were also metaphorically true. Aileen was being tortured, not with sonic devices, but with the slow, grinding psychological torture of death row. She was being controlled, not through mind control technology, but through the total institutional control of her body, her movements, her communications, her every breath. The conspiracy she described was the conspiracy of a system designed to kill her, and that conspiracy was real. She also spoke about the murders with a chilling mixture of honesty and justification. She admitted that she had killed the men, that she had taken their money and possessions, but she continued to insist that they had deserved it, that they were rapists and abusers, that she had done the world a service by killing them. "I'd kill them again," she said in one interview. "Every single one of them. They were scum. They were predators. I was just doing what needed to be done." The interviews were used by prosecutors to argue that Aileen remained dangerous, that she showed no genuine remorse, that execution was the only appropriate response. But they were also evidence of a profoundly damaged person, someone whose entire life had been defined by violence, who had never learned any other language, any other way of understanding the world. The execution of Aileen Carol Wuornos was scheduled for the morning of October 9th, 2002. In the days leading up to the execution, protests formed outside the prison, death penalty opponents holding vigils, victims' rights advocates demanding justice, media crews capturing it all. Aileen's story, which had begun in obscurity and abandonment, was ending in spectacle. Inside the prison, Aileen spent her final days in isolation, allowed brief phone calls and visits. Arlene Prowl, her adoptive mother, visited and prayed with her, though their relationship had become strained by years of exploitation and disappointment. Don Botkins, a childhood friend who had reconnected with Aileen during her incarceration, spoke with her by phone, one of the few people who seemed to genuinely care about her as a person rather than as a story. Aileen's last words, her final statement before execution, would become part of her legend. But in the days before, in the quiet of her cell, she wrote letters that revealed a woman who was tired, afraid, and still desperately seeking some kind of understanding or absolution. I know I am going to die, she wrote. I know what I did was wrong, but I also know that I was trying to survive in a world that had been trying to kill me since the day I was born. I don't know if that makes it okay. I don't know if anything makes it okay. I just know that I'm tired and I'm ready for it to be over. The rain fell on Florida in those final days, washing over the prison walls, over the highways where 7 men had died, over the motels and bars and truck stops where Aileen had worked and survived. It fell on the graves of the victims, on the homes of their families, on the streets of Troy, Michigan, where a damaged child had once been born into a world that would never offer her mercy. The drowning moon hung heavy in the sky, its light cold and unforgiving, illuminating the path that had led from childhood abuse to death row, from victimization to violence, from someone's daughter to America's most infamous female serial killer. The moon did not judge. It simply watched, as it had watched for 33 years, as Aileen Carol Wuornos moved through a life defined by pain and rage and desperate, doomed attempts at love. And as the execution date approached, as the machinery of state sanctioned death began its final preparations, the question that had haunted Aileen's entire life remained unanswered. What would it have taken to save her? What intervention, what moment of genuine care, what systemic change might have diverted her from this path? No one asked these questions in a way that mattered. The time for asking had long passed. Now there was only the ending, inevitable and inexorable, a public execution in slow motion that had been decades in the making, a final chapter in a story that should never have been written, but that, once begun, could only end one way. There is a particular silence that exists in the corridors of death row, a quiet that is not peaceful but oppressive, heavy with the weight of lives suspended between existence and extinction. It is the silence of waiting, of days that stretch into months, that stretch into years, of time that moves both too slowly and too quickly, of people who are alive but already counted among the dead. For Aileen Carol Wuornos, this silence became the soundtrack of her final decade, the white noise against which the last act of her life played out. The Broward Correctional Institution, where Florida housed its female death row inmates in the early 1990s, was located in Pembroke Pines, a suburb north of Miami. The death row unit was a separate building within the larger prison complex, segregated from the general population both physically and psychologically. It was a place apart, a waiting room for the condemned, where fewer than a dozen women at any given time lived out their days in isolation, their executions delayed by the glacial pace of the appeals process, but never truly in doubt. Aileen arrived at Broward in April of 1992, transported from Volusia County in the back of a prison van, shackled at the wrists and ankles, a chain around her waist connecting the restraints. The journey took several hours, driving south through the length of the state, past the highways where she had worked and killed, past the motels and truck stops that had been her home for so many years. She stared out the window of the van, watching Florida pass by. knowing she would never see most of it again, that her world had contracted to the 6 by 9 foot cell that awaited her. The intake process at Broward was thorough and dehumanizing. She was strip searched, examined for contraband, photographed, fingerprinted again. Her personal possessions, what few she had, were cataloged and confiscated. She was given a prison uniform, standard issue, pale blue and shapeless. Her hair was cut short, though she would later grow it out again. She was assigned a cell number, D3, third cell on the D wing of the death row unit. The cell was exactly as she had imagined it would be, which somehow made it worse. Concrete block walls painted a pale yellow that had faded to the color of old teeth. A metal bunk bolted to the wall with a thin mattress that smelled of disinfectant and the bodies of previous occupants. A metal toilet and sink combination in the corner. No privacy, no dignity. A small metal shelf bolted to the wall, a fluorescent light fixture in the ceiling, protected by a metal grate that never fully turned off, just dimmed slightly at night, casting the cell in perpetual twilight. There was a narrow window high on the wall, 6 inches wide and 2 feet long, reinforced glass so thick and scratched it was almost opaque. Through it, on clear days, Aileen could see a rectangle of sky, clouds passing, the faint suggestion of sunlight. But she could not see the ground, could not see trees or grass or any other human being. The window was a taunt, a reminder that the world continued outside her cell while she remained frozen in time. The daily routine on death row was monotonous and suffocating. Aileen woke at 6 a.m. when the lights brightened to full intensity. Breakfast was delivered through a slot in the door: cold cereal, powdered milk, a piece of fruit if she was lucky. She ate alone in her cell, the plastic spoon the only utensil she was allowed. After breakfast, she had 1 hour of recreation time, though recreation was a euphemism. She was allowed to leave her cell and walk in a small outdoor cage, a chain link enclosure 20 feet by 20 feet, open to the sky, but surrounded by concrete walls. She could walk in circles, do exercises, breathe air that was not filtered through metal and concrete. Then the hour ended and she was returned to her cell. The rest of the day stretched ahead with no structure, no purpose. She could read if she had books from the prison library, though the selection was limited and arbitrary. She could write letters if she had paper and stamps, which had to be purchased from the commissary with money from her account. She could watch the small television that was installed in her cell, though it only received a handful of channels and the picture was grainy and unreliable. Mostly she waited. She waited for lunch, for dinner, for the lights to dim, for sleep that often did not come. Human contact was minimal and strictly controlled. She was not allowed to interact with other death row inmates except in passing during recreation time, and even then, conversation was discouraged by the guards. She saw the guards regularly. They conducted head counts every few hours, checking to ensure she had not somehow escaped or died. But they rarely spoke to her beyond perfunctory commands: move back from the door, hands through the slot, turn around, the language of control and containment. Visits were allowed, but they were rare and tightly regulated. Visitors had to be approved in advance, had to submit to background checks, had to travel to Pembroke Pines and endure the humiliating process of prison security: metal detectors, pat downs, rules about clothing and what could be brought in. The visiting area was a room divided by plexiglass, communication through telephone handsets, no physical contact allowed. Aileen would sit on one side of the glass and the visitor on the other, and they would talk through static filled phones, their voices disembodied, the barrier between them insurmountable. In the early months, Aileen had almost no visitors. Her family had abandoned her completely. Diane, her mother, never contacted her. Laurie, her grandfather, had died in 1991, never acknowledging Aileen's existence even in death. Tyria, The person Aileen most wanted to see, to speak to beg for understanding or forgiveness, was gone, protected by her immunity deal and her desire to forget, to move on, to pretend that her years with Aileen had never happened. But Aileen was not entirely alone. The notoriety of her case attracted people, some sincere, some exploitative, all of them drawn to her story for their own reasons. They wrote letters, dozens at first, then hundreds. Some were from religious crusaders who saw her as a soul to be saved. Some were from true crime enthusiasts who wanted to understand how a woman could kill 7 men. Some were from journalists and documentary filmmakers who saw a story that could make their careers. Some were from lonely, damaged people who identified with her pain and wanted to offer connection, however tenuous. Aileen read every letter. She spent hours in her cell reading and rereading the correspondence, analyzing the words for hidden meanings, for evidence of genuine care or manipulative intent. She responded to many of them, her handwriting looping and irregular, her spelling atrocious, her thoughts pouring onto the page in streams of consciousness that ranged from coherent to chaotic. The letters she wrote in the first years on death row reveal a woman oscillating wildly between mental states. Some letters are lucid, reflective, almost literary in their examination of her life and crimes. I know what I did was wrong, she wrote to one correspondent in 1993. I know I took lives that weren't mine to take. I think about those men every day. I see their faces. I wonder if they were scared, if they suffered, if they had families who are suffering now because of me. I don't know how to live with that. I don't know how to be sorry enough. But other letters, sometimes written the same week, contradict this remorse entirely, reverting to defiant self justification. I didn't murder anyone, she wrote in another letter. I defended myself against rapists and abusers. Every single one of those men was a predator. They picked me up because they thought I was easy prey, because they thought they could do whatever they wanted to a prostitute and nobody would care. But I fought back, and now I'm being executed for it while they're being treated like innocent victims. It's bullshit. The contradictions were not lies exactly, but different truths coexisting in a mind that could not settle on a single narrative. Aileen genuinely believed in the moment she wrote them that both statements were true, that she was a murderer who deserved punishment, and that she was a victim who had acted in self defense. Her fractured psyche could hold both realities simultaneously, shifting between them based on her mood, her level of paranoia, her need for validation or absolution. Among the many people who wrote to Aileen in those early months was Arlene Prowler, a woman who would become the most significant relationship in Aileen's final decade. Prowler was a born again Christian, a horse breeder who lived in Ocala, Florida, about 2 hours north of Pembroke Pines. She was in her 40s, married to a man named Robert, and she had become obsessed with Aileen's case after seeing news coverage of the trial. Prowler later described her interest in Aileen as a calling from God, a divine instruction to reach out to this lost soul and offer her salvation. But there was also something more complicated in the attraction, a need to be needed, a savior complex, a desire to be part of something dramatic and meaningful. Crawley was a woman living an ordinary life who wanted to matter, and Aileen's extraordinary circumstances offered her that opportunity. She wrote her first letter to Aileen in February of 1992, while Aileen was still in the Volusia County Jail awaiting transfer to death row. The letter was effusive, emotional, filled with biblical quotations and assurances of God's love. Crowley told Aileen that she had been praying for her, that God had spoken to her heart, that she felt a spiritual connection to Aileen despite having never met her. Aileen was suspicious at first. She had learned long ago that expressions of love and care usually came with conditions, that people wanted something from her. But she was also desperately lonely, starving for connection, and Prala's letters offered something she had never had: unconditional acceptance, or what appeared to be unconditional acceptance. Prala did not judge her for her crimes. She acknowledged them, but framed them as sins that could be forgiven through Christ's sacrifice. She told Aileen that she was loved, that she was worthy, that she was not alone. The correspondence between them intensified quickly. Prala wrote several times a week, long letters filled with Bible verses, encouragement, maternal affection. Aileen responded with equal fervor, pouring out her pain and her hope, calling Prala mom almost from the beginning, embracing the fantasy that she had finally found the mother she had never had. By November of 1991, just months after they began corresponding, Arlene Prala legally adopted Aileen as her adult daughter. Florida law allowed for adult adoption in certain circumstances, and Prowlett petitioned the court, arguing that Aileen needed family support and spiritual guidance. The adoption was granted, and Aileen Carol Wuornos became legally and officially Aileen Carol Wuornos Prowlett. The adoption was both genuine and performative. Crowley genuinely cared about Aileen in some capacity, genuinely believed she was fulfilling a spiritual calling. But the adoption also generated significant media attention, book deals, interview opportunities, financial compensation. Crowley and her lawyer, Steve Glazer, began negotiating movie rights and documentary deals, selling Aileen's story to the highest bidder and taking a percentage of the profits. They positioned themselves as Aileen's protectors, but they were also profiting from her notoriety. Aileen was aware of the exploitation on some level, but chose to overlook it because the alternative, acknowledging that even this relationship was transactional, was too painful. She needed Arlene to be the mother she had never had, needed to believe that someone loved her without wanting anything in return. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain this belief was immense, but Aileen had spent her life performing mental gymnastics to survive. This was just one more. Arlene visited Aileen regularly. During the first few years, she was on death row. She would make the drive from Ocala to Pembroke Pines, sometimes weekly, sometimes monthly, depending on her schedule and finances. The visits followed the same pattern. They would sit on opposite sides of the plexiglass barrier, pick up the phones, and talk for the allotted hour. Arlene would read Bible passages, pray aloud, ask Aileen about her spiritual state. Aileen would cry, confess her fears and regrets, ask Arlene to pray for her. They would talk about mundane things too, what Aileen was reading, what Arlene's horses were doing, the weather, anything to fill the silence and create the illusion of normalcy. But beneath the surface, the relationship was fraught with tension and manipulation on both sides. Arlene wanted Aileen to perform repentance, to embrace Christianity fully and publicly, to be a symbol of redemption that validated Arlene's belief in the transformative power of faith. Aileen wanted Arlene to love her unconditionally, to visit her regardless of her behavior, to be the mother who would never abandon her. When either of them failed to meet these expectations, conflict erupted. Aileen's conversion to Christianity was intense but unstable. For several months in 1992 and 1993, she embraced the born again narrative completely. She read the Bible voraciously, underlining passages, memorizing verses. She attended the prison chapel services when they were offered. She wrote letters filled with religious language, testifying to her salvation and her newfound relationship with Jesus Christ. I have been saved by the grace of God, she wrote to a supporter in 1993. I know that I am a sinner, that I have committed terrible sins, but I also know that Jesus died for those sins and that I am forgiven. I feel his presence in my cell. I feel his love. For the first time in my life, I am not alone. But the conversion did not last. By 1994, Aileen's faith had curdled into resentment and cynicism. She began to see Christianity as another form of control. another institution that demanded her obedience and offered nothing in return. She accused Arlene of using her, of profiting from her story while pretending to care. She stopped attending chapel, stopped reading the Bible, stopped writing about God except to curse him. The disillusionment was partly rational. Arlene was using her, and the promises of salvation had not alleviated her suffering. But it was also a manifestation of Aileen's borderline personality disorder. She idealized Arlene and Christianity, projected all her hopes onto them, and when they inevitably failed to save her, she devalued them completely, swinging from adoration to contempt. Arlene continued to visit for a while, trying to salvage the relationship, but the visits became increasingly difficult. Aileen would scream at her through the phone, accusing her of betrayal, demanding money, threatening to cut off contact. Arlene would leave in tears, vowing never to return, only to come back weeks later, convinced that God was calling her to persevere. By the late 1990s, the relationship had deteriorated to the point of collapse. Arlene's visits became infrequent, then stopped altogether. They still corresponded occasionally, but the letters were cold, perfunctory, stripped of the emotional intensity that had once defined their connection. The adoption remained legally valid, but the relationship it was supposed to represent had died. Another abandonment in a life defined by them. While Arlene Prowl was the most prominent figure in Aileen's death row social circle, she was not the only one. Aileen maintained correspondence with a rotating cast of journalists, documentary filmmakers, true crime writers, and random supporters, each relationship following a similar arc: initial excitement and idealization, followed by conflict and disillusionment, followed by rupture. The journalists were particularly drawn to Aileen because she was willing to talk, willing to give interviews, willing to provide content for their stories. She spoke with reporters from the New York Times, the Miami Herald, Vanity Fair, and dozens of smaller publications. She gave interviews to television programs, sitting in the prison visiting room with cameras pointed at her through the plexiglass, answering questions about her childhood, her crimes, her feelings about death. Some of these interviews were thoughtful and humanizing, attempts to understand Aileen as a person rather than a monster. But most were exploitative, focused on the sensational aspects of her story: the sex work, the lesbianism, the murders, while ignoring the systemic failures and traumas that had shaped her. The journalists asked the same questions over and over. What was it like to kill someone? Do you feel remorse? Are you afraid to die? And Aileen gave different answers each time, her narrative shifting like sand, impossible to pin down. The most significant journalistic relationship Aileen had was with British filmmaker Nick Broomfield, who made two documentaries about her: Aileen Wuornos, The Selling of a Serial Killer in 1992, and Aileen, Life and Death of a Serial Killer in 2003. Broomfield was a controversial figure in documentary filmmaking, known for his confrontational style and his willingness to insert himself into his subjects' stories. His films about Aileen were both exposés of the exploitation she suffered and examples of that exploitation. The first documentary focused heavily on Arlene Prala and Steve Glazer, Aileen's lawyer, showing them negotiating movie rights and interview fees, treating Aileen as a commodity. Broomfield interviewed Aileen extensively, and the footage showed a woman who was intelligent, articulate, and deeply damaged. She spoke about the murders with chilling matter of factness, describing the shootings as though they were ordinary events. She also spoke about her childhood with heartbreaking vulnerability, describing the abuse and neglect with a detachment that made it clear she had never processed the trauma. Broomfield paid Aileen for the interviews, a practice that was ethically questionable but legal, and the money went into her commissary account, allowing her to buy small luxuries: better food from the prison canteen, stamps and stationery, toiletries, cigarettes when they were still allowed. The money was a lifeline, a reminder that she still had some value in the world. even if that value was predicated on her willingness to perform her trauma for cameras. But the relationship with Broomfield was complicated by the same dynamic that characterized all of Aileen's relationships. She wanted genuine connection, but the relationship was fundamentally transactional. Broomfield was there because she was a story, because her life and death would make a compelling documentary. When the filming ended, the relationship ended, and Aileen, once again, was left with the bitter knowledge that people cared about her story, but not about her. The letters Aileen wrote during this period reveal the profound loneliness and instability of her existence. She wrote to dozens of people: pen pals, supporters, journalists, lawyers, and the letters show a woman desperately trying to maintain connections to the outside world, to assert that she was still alive, still human, still worthy of attention. To some correspondents, she wrote with surprising insight and self awareness. "I know I'm mentally ill," she wrote to one supporter in 1995. "I know my moods swing all over the place. One day I'm angry, the next day I'm sad, the next day I'm convinced everyone is out to get me. I don't know how to stop it. The medication helps sometimes, but mostly it just makes me feel numb, like I'm watching my life from outside my body." To others, she wrote with paranoia and rage. "The guards are torturing me," she wrote in 1996. "They're putting things in my food to make me sick. They're using machines to beam voices into my head. They want me to go crazy so they can say I'm incompetent to be executed and keep me locked up here forever. It's all part of a conspiracy." The paranoia was not entirely unfounded. Life on death row was psychologically torturous by design. The isolation, the constant surveillance, the knowledge that you were waiting to be killed, all of it was calculated to break people down. But Aileen's interpretations went beyond rational responses to an oppressive environment. She believed in elaborate conspiracies, saw malevolent intent in every action, interpreted neutral events as personal attacks. This was mental illness compounded by incarceration, trauma compounded by hopelessness. Her writing style in the letters was distinctive and revealing. She wrote in long, unpunctuated streams of consciousness, thoughts tumbling over each other without paragraph breaks or logical transitions. She capitalized words for emphasis seemingly at random. She misspelled common words but used complex vocabulary correctly, evidence of an intelligence that had never been formally educated. She switched topics abruptly, from discussing her case to describing a dream to ranting about a guard to expressing love for a correspondent, all in the same letter. The letters also revealed her ongoing obsession with Tyria Moore. Years after their last contact, Aileen was still writing about Tyria, still processing the betrayal, still trying to understand how the person she loved most could have turned on her so completely. "I dream about Ty almost every night," she wrote in 1997. "Sometimes they're good dreams, memories of when we were happy, when we were just two people in love trying to survive. Sometimes they're nightmares, her testifying against me, her telling the police everything, her saving herself and leaving me to die. I wake up and I don't know which version is real, or if they're both real, if she loved me and betrayed me at the same time." In another letter, the tone was harsher. "Tyria Moore is a coward and a liar. She used me for years, lived off the money I made, and then when things got hard, she ran. She made a deal to save herself and threw me to the wolves. I hope she can live with herself. I hope she thinks about me every day and feels the weight of what she did." The oscillation between love and hate, between understanding and rage, was characteristic of borderline personality disorder. Aileen could not integrate the contradictory truths about Tyria: that she had genuinely loved Aileen and that she had genuinely betrayed her, so she swung between them, never finding resolution. There is a particular silence that exists in the corridors of death row, a quiet that is not peaceful but oppressive, heavy with the weight of lives suspended between existence and extinction. It is the silence of waiting, of days that stretch into months, that stretch into years, of time that moves both too slowly and too quickly, of people who are alive but already counted among the dead. For Aileen Carol Wuornos, this silence became the soundtrack of her final decade, the white noise against which the last act of her life played out. The Broward Correctional Institution, where Florida housed its female death row inmates in the early 1990s, was located in Pembroke Pines, a suburb north of Miami. The death row unit was a separate building within the larger prison complex, segregated from the general population both physically and psychologically. It was a place apart, a waiting room for the condemned, where fewer than a dozen women at any given time lived out their days in isolation, their executions delayed by the glacial pace of the appeals process, but never truly in doubt. Aileen arrived at Broward in April of 1992, transported from Volusia County in the back of a prison van, shackled at the wrists and ankles, a chain around her waist connecting the restraints. The journey took several hours, driving south through the length of the state, past the highways where she had worked and killed, past the motels and truck stops that had been her home for so many years. She stared out the window of the van, watching Florida pass by, knowing she would never see most of it again, that her world had contracted to the 6 by 9 foot cell that awaited her. The intake process at Broward was thorough and dehumanizing. She was strip searched, examined for contraband, photographed, fingerprinted again. Her personal possessions, what few she had, were cataloged and confiscated. She was given a prison uniform, standard issue, pale blue and shapeless. Her hair was cut short, though she would later grow it out again. She was assigned a cell number, D3, third cell on the D wing of the death row unit. The cell was exactly as she had imagined it would be, which somehow made it worse. Concrete block walls painted a pale yellow that had faded to the color of old teeth. A metal bunk bolted to the wall with a thin mattress that smelled of disinfectant and the bodies of previous occupants. A metal toilet and sink combination in the corner. No privacy, no dignity. A small metal shelf bolted to the wall, a fluorescent light fixture in the ceiling, protected by a metal grate that never fully turned off, just dimmed slightly at night, casting the cell in perpetual twilight. There was a narrow window high on the wall, 6 inches wide and 2 feet long, reinforced glass so thick and scratched it was almost opaque. Through it, on clear days, Aileen could see a rectangle of sky, clouds passing, the faint suggestion of sunlight. But she could not see the ground, could not see trees or grass or any other human being. The window was a taunt, a reminder that the world continued outside her cell while she remained frozen in time. The daily routine on death row was monotonous and suffocating. Aileen woke at 6 a.m. when the lights brightened to full intensity. Breakfast was delivered through a slot in the door: cold cereal, powdered milk, a piece of fruit if she was lucky. She ate alone in her cell, the plastic spoon the only utensil she was allowed. After breakfast, she had 1 hour of recreation time, though recreation was a euphemism. She was allowed to leave her cell and walk in a small outdoor cage, a chain link enclosure 20 feet by 20 feet, open to the sky, but surrounded by concrete walls. She could walk in circles, do exercises, breathe air that was not filtered through metal and concrete. Then the hour ended and she was returned to her cell. The rest of the day stretched ahead with no structure, no purpose. She could read if she had books from the prison library, though the selection was limited and arbitrary. She could write letters if she had paper and stamps, which had to be purchased from the commissary with money from her account. She could watch the small television that was installed in her cell, though it only received a handful of channels and the picture was grainy and unreliable. Mostly she waited. She waited for lunch, for dinner, for the lights to dim, for sleep that often did not come. Human contact was minimal and strictly controlled. She was not allowed to interact with other death row inmates except in passing during recreation time, and even then, conversation was discouraged by the guards. She saw the guards regularly. They conducted head counts every few hours, checking to ensure she had not somehow escaped or died. But they rarely spoke to her beyond perfunctory commands. Move back from the door, hands through the slot, turn around, the language of control and containment. Visits were allowed, but they were rare and tightly regulated. Visitors had to be approved in advance, had to submit to background checks, had to travel to Pembroke Pines and endure the humiliating process of prison security. Metal detectors, pat downs, rules about clothing and what could be brought in. The visiting area was a room divided by plexiglass, communication through telephone handsets, no physical contact allowed. Aileen would sit on one side of the glass and the visitor on the other, and they would talk through static filled phones, their voices disembodied, the barrier between them insurmountable. In the early months, Aileen had almost no visitors. Her family had abandoned her completely. Diane, her mother, never contacted her. Laurie, her grandfather, had died in 1991, never acknowledging Aileen's existence, even in death. Tyria, the person Aileen most wanted to see, to speak to beg for understanding or forgiveness, was gone, protected by her immunity deal and her desire to forget, to move on, to pretend that her years with Aileen had never happened. But Aileen was not entirely alone. The notoriety of her case attracted people, some sincere, some exploitative, all of them drawn to her story for their own reasons. They wrote letters, dozens at first, then hundreds. Some were from religious crusaders who saw her as a soul to be saved. Some were from true crime enthusiasts who wanted to understand how a woman could kill 7 men. Some were from journalists and documentary filmmakers who saw a story that could make their careers. Some were from lonely, damaged people who identified with her pain and wanted to offer connection, however tenuous. Aileen read every letter. She spent hours in her cell reading and rereading the correspondence, analyzing the words for hidden meanings, for evidence of genuine care or manipulative intent. She responded to many of them, her handwriting looping and irregular, her spelling atrocious, her thoughts pouring onto the page in streams of consciousness that ranged from coherent to chaotic. The letters she wrote in the first years on death row reveal a woman oscillating wildly between mental states. Some letters are lucid, reflective, almost literary in their examination of her life and crimes. I know what I did was wrong, she wrote to one correspondent in 1993. I know I took lives that weren't mine to take. I think about those men every day. I see their faces. I wonder if they were scared, if they suffered, if they had families who are suffering now because of me. I don't know how to live with that. I don't know how to be sorry enough. But other letters, sometimes written the same week, contradict this remorse entirely, reverting to defiant self justification. I didn't murder anyone, she wrote in another letter. I defended myself against rapists and abusers. Every single one of those men was a predator. They picked me up because they thought I was easy prey, because they thought they could do whatever they wanted to a prostitute and nobody would care. But I fought back, and now I'm being executed for it while they're being treated like innocent victims. It's bullshit. The contradictions were not lies exactly, but different truths coexisting in a mind that could not settle on a single narrative. Aileen genuinely believed in the moment she wrote them that both statements were true, that she was a murderer who deserved punishment, and that she was a victim who had acted in self defense. Her fractured psyche could hold both realities simultaneously, shifting between them based on her mood, her level of paranoia, her need for validation or absolution. Among the many people who wrote to Aileen in those early months was Arlene Prout, a woman who would become the most significant relationship in Aileen's final decade. Prowler was a born again Christian, a horse breeder who lived in Ocala, Florida, about 2 hours north of Pembroke Pines. She was in her 40s, married to a man named Robert, and she had become obsessed with Aileen's case after seeing news coverage of the trial. Prala later described her interest in Aileen as a calling from God, a divine instruction to reach out to this lost soul and offer her salvation. But there was also something more complicated in the attraction, a need to be needed, a savior complex, a desire to be part of something dramatic and meaningful. Prale was a woman living an ordinary life who wanted to matter, and Aileen's extraordinary circumstances offered her that opportunity. She wrote her first letter to Aileen in February of 1992, while Aileen was still in the Volusia County Jail awaiting transfer to death row. The letter was effusive, emotional, filled with biblical quotations and assurances of God's love. Prale told Aileen that she had been praying for her, that God had spoken to her heart, that she felt a spiritual connection to Aileen despite having never met her. Aileen was suspicious at first. She had learned long ago that expressions of love and care usually came with conditions, that people wanted something from her. But she was also desperately lonely, starving for connection, and Prala's letters offered something she had never had: unconditional acceptance, or what appeared to be unconditional acceptance. Prala did not judge her for her crimes. She acknowledged them, but framed them as sins that could be forgiven through Christ's sacrifice. She told Aileen that she was loved, that she was worthy, that she was not alone. The correspondence between them intensified quickly. Prala wrote several times a week, long letters filled with Bible verses, encouragement, maternal affection. Aileen responded with equal fervor, pouring out her pain and her hope, calling Prala mom almost from the beginning, embracing the fantasy that she had finally found the mother she had never had. By November of 1991, just months after they began corresponding, Arlene Prala legally adopted Aileen as her adult daughter. Florida law allowed for adult adoption in certain circumstances, and Prowlett petitioned the court, arguing that Aileen needed family support and spiritual guidance. The adoption was granted, and Aileen Carol Wuornos became legally and officially Aileen Carol Wuornos Prowlett. The adoption was both genuine and performative. Crowley genuinely cared about Aileen in some capacity, genuinely believed she was fulfilling a spiritual calling. But the adoption also generated significant media attention, book deals, interview opportunities, financial compensation. Crowley and her lawyer, Steve Glazer, began negotiating movie rights and documentary deals, selling Aileen's story to the highest bidder and taking a percentage of the profits. They positioned themselves as Aileen's protectors, but they were also profiting from her notoriety. Aileen was aware of the exploitation on some level, but chose to overlook it because the alternative, acknowledging that even this relationship was transactional, was too painful. She needed Arlene to be the mother she had never had, needed to believe that someone loved her without wanting anything in return. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain this belief was immense, but Aileen had spent her life performing mental gymnastics to survive. This was just one more. Arlene visited Aileen regularly. During the first few years, she was on death row. She would make the drive from Ocala to Pembroke Pines, sometimes weekly, sometimes monthly, depending on her schedule and finances. The visits followed the same pattern. They would sit on opposite sides of the plexiglass barrier, pick up the phones, and talk for the allotted hour. Arlene would read Bible passages, pray aloud, ask Aileen about her spiritual state. Aileen would cry, confess her fears and regrets, ask Arlene to pray for her. They would talk about mundane things too: what Aileen was reading, what Arlene's horses were doing, the weather, anything to fill the silence and create the illusion of normalcy. But beneath the surface, the relationship was fraught with tension and manipulation on both sides. Arlene wanted Aileen to perform repentance, to embrace Christianity fully and publicly, to be a symbol of redemption that validated Arlene's belief in the transformative power of faith. Aileen wanted Arlene to love her unconditionally, to visit her regardless of her behavior, to be the mother who would never abandon her. When either of them failed to meet these expectations, conflict erupted. Aileen's conversion to Christianity was intense but unstable. For several months in 1992 and 1993, she embraced the born again narrative completely. She read the Bible voraciously, underlining passages, memorizing verses. She attended the prison chapel services when they were offered. She wrote letters filled with religious language, testifying to her salvation and her newfound relationship with Jesus Christ. I have been saved by the grace of God, she wrote to a supporter in 1993. I know that I am a sinner, that I have committed terrible sins, but I also know that Jesus died for those sins and that I am forgiven. I feel his presence in my cell. I feel his love. For the first time in my life, I am not alone. But the conversion did not last. By 1994, Aileen's faith had curdled into resentment and cynicism. She began to see Christianity as another form of control, another institution that demanded her obedience and offered nothing in return. She accused Arlene of using her, of profiting from her story while pretending to care. She stopped attending chapel, stopped reading the Bible, stopped writing about God except to curse him. The disillusionment was partly rational. Arlene was using her, and the promises of salvation had not alleviated her suffering. But it was also a manifestation of Aileen's borderline personality disorder. She idealized Arlene and Christianity, projected all her hopes onto them, and when they inevitably failed to save her, she devalued them completely, swinging from adoration to contempt. Arlene continued to visit for a while, trying to salvage the relationship, but the visits became increasingly difficult. Aileen would scream at her through the phone, accusing her of betrayal, demanding money, threatening to cut off contact. Arlene would leave in tears, vowing never to return, only to come back weeks later, convinced that God was calling her to persevere. By the late 1990s, the relationship had deteriorated to the point of collapse. Arlene's visits became infrequent, then stopped altogether. They still corresponded occasionally, but the letters were cold, perfunctory, stripped of the emotional intensity that had once defined their connection. The adoption remained legally valid, but the relationship it was supposed to represent had died. Another abandonment in a life defined by them. While Arlene Prowl was the most prominent figure in Aileen's death row social circle, she was not the only one. Aileen maintained correspondence with a rotating cast of journalists, documentary filmmakers, true crime writers, and random supporters, each relationship following a similar arc: initial excitement and idealization, followed by conflict and disillusionment, followed by rupture. The journalists were particularly drawn to Aileen because she was willing to talk, willing to give interviews, willing to provide content for their stories. She spoke with reporters from the New York Times, the Miami Herald, Vanity Fair, and dozens of smaller publications. She gave interviews to television programs, sitting in the prison visiting room with cameras pointed at her through the plexiglass, answering questions about her childhood, her crimes, her feelings about death. Some of these interviews were thoughtful and humanizing, attempts to understand Aileen as a person rather than a monster. But most were exploitative, focused on the sensational aspects of her story: the sex work, the lesbianism, the murders, while ignoring the systemic failures and traumas that had shaped her. The journalists asked the same questions over and over. What was it like to kill someone? Do you feel remorse? Are you afraid to die? And Aileen gave different answers each time, her narrative shifting like sand, impossible to pin down. The most significant journalistic relationship Aileen had was with British filmmaker Nick Broomfield, who made two documentaries about her: Aileen Wuornos, The Selling of a Serial Killer in 1992, and Aileen, Life and Death of a Serial Killer in 2003. Broomfield was a controversial figure in documentary filmmaking, known for his confrontational style and his willingness to insert himself into his subjects' stories. His films about Aileen were both exposés of the exploitation she suffered and examples of that exploitation. The first documentary focused heavily on Arlene Prala and Steve Glazer, Aileen's lawyer, showing them negotiating movie rights and interview fees, treating Aileen as a commodity. Broomfield interviewed Aileen extensively, and the footage showed a woman who was intelligent, articulate, and deeply damaged. She spoke about the murders with chilling matter of factness, describing the shootings as though they were ordinary events. She also spoke about her childhood with heartbreaking vulnerability, describing the abuse and neglect with a detachment that made it clear she had never processed the trauma. Broomfield paid Aileen for the interviews, a practice that was ethically questionable but legal, and the money went into her commissary account, allowing her to buy small luxuries: better food from the prison canteen, stamps and stationery, toiletries, cigarettes when they were still allowed. The money was a lifeline, a reminder that she still had some value in the world, even if that value was predicated on her willingness to perform her trauma for cameras. But the relationship with Broomfield was complicated by the same dynamic that characterized all of Aileen's relationships. She wanted genuine connection, but the relationship was fundamentally transactional. Broomfield was there because she was a story, because her life and death would make a compelling documentary. When the filming ended, the relationship ended, and Aileen, once again, was left with the bitter knowledge that people cared about her story, but not about her. The letters Aileen wrote during this period reveal the profound loneliness and instability of her existence. She wrote to dozens of people: pen pals, supporters, journalists, lawyers, and the letters show a woman desperately trying to maintain connections to the outside world, to assert that she was still alive, still human, still worthy of attention. To some correspondents, she wrote with surprising insight and self awareness. "I know I'm mentally ill," she wrote to one supporter in 1995. "I know my moods swing all over the place. One day I'm angry, the next day I'm sad, the next day I'm convinced everyone is out to get me. I don't know how to stop it. The medication helps sometimes, but mostly it just makes me feel numb, like I'm watching my life from outside my body." To others, she wrote with paranoia and rage. "The guards are torturing me," she wrote in 1996. "They're putting things in my food to make me sick. They're using machines to beam voices into my head. They want me to go crazy so they can say I'm incompetent to be executed and keep me locked up here forever. It's all part of a conspiracy." The paranoia was not entirely unfounded. Life on death row was psychologically torturous by design. The isolation, the constant surveillance, the knowledge that you were waiting to be killed, all of it was calculated to break people down. But Aileen's interpretations went beyond rational responses to an oppressive environment. She believed in elaborate conspiracies, saw malevolent intent in every action, interpreted neutral events as personal attacks. This was mental illness compounded by incarceration, trauma compounded by hopelessness. Her writing style in the letters was distinctive and revealing. She wrote in long, unpunctuated streams of consciousness, thoughts tumbling over each other without paragraph breaks or logical transitions. She capitalized words for emphasis seemingly at random. She misspelled common words but used complex vocabulary correctly, evidence of an intelligence that had never been formally educated. She switched topics abruptly, from discussing her case to describing a dream to ranting about a guard to expressing love for a correspondent. all in the same letter. The letters also revealed her ongoing obsession with Tyria Moore. Years after their last contact, Aileen was still writing about Tyria, still processing the betrayal, still trying to understand how the person she loved most could have turned on her so completely. I dream about Ty almost every night, she wrote in 1997. Sometimes they're good dreams, memories of when we were happy, when we were just two people in love trying to survive. Sometimes they're nightmares, her testifying against me, her telling the police everything, her saving herself and leaving me to die. I wake up and I don't know which version is real, or if they're both real, if she loved me and betrayed me at the same time. In another letter, the tone was harsher. Tyria Moore is a coward and a liar. She used me for years, lived off the money I made, and then when things got hard, she ran. She made a deal to save herself and threw me to the wolves. I hope she can live with herself. I hope she thinks about me every day and feels the weight of what she did. The oscillation between love and hate, between understanding and rage, was characteristic of borderline personality disorder. Aileen could not integrate the contradictory truths about Tyria, that she had genuinely loved Aileen and that she had genuinely betrayed her, so she swung between them, never finding resolution. Beyond the correspondence and visits, Aileen's daily life on death row was marked by small rituals and desperate attempts to maintain her sanity. She read voraciously, romance novels, true crime books, magazines, anything she could get from the prison library or that supporters sent her. She watched television obsessively, particularly soap operas and talk shows, drawn to the melodrama and emotional intensity that mirrored her own inner life. She wrote constantly, not just letters, but journals, essays, fragments of autobiography. Most of this writing was confiscated by the prison or lost, but what remains provides insight into her mental state. She wrote about her childhood with forensic detail, describing specific instances of abuse, trying to understand how that child had become this woman. She wrote about the murders, sometimes justifying them, sometimes expressing horror at what she had done. She wrote about death, about what she imagined execution would feel like, whether there was an afterlife, whether she would be punished or forgiven. She also drew and created art. Though she had no formal training and limited materials, she drew portraits of Tyria from memory, sketched scenes from her childhood, created abstract images that seemed to represent her mental chaos. The art was crude but emotionally powerful, visual manifestations of pain and longing and rage. Her relationships with other death row inmates were limited but significant. The women on death row with her were a diverse group. Some had killed their abusive partners, some had killed their children, some had killed for money or drugs, or in the commission of other crimes. They were separated by plexiglass and rules and the isolating structure of death row, but they found ways to communicate, shouting through vents, passing notes through sympathetic guards, brief conversations during recreation time. Aileen formed a tentative friendship with a woman named Judy Buenawano, who had been convicted of murdering her husband and son. Buenoano was older, more educated, more socially adept than Aileen, and she took on something of a mentoring role. She advised Aileen on how to navigate the prison system, how to manage her appeals, how to survive psychologically. But the relationship was limited by the constraints of their environment and by Buenoano's execution in 1999, another loss in a life of losses. The passage of time on death row was both glacial and swift. Days blurred together into an undifferentiated mass of waiting. Weeks passed without anything changing, and yet the years accumulated with shocking speed. 1992 became 1995, became 2000. Aileen was in her late 30s, then her 40s. Her body aged rapidly in the harsh environment, poor nutrition, lack of exercise, chronic stress, inadequate medical care, all taking their toll. Her face became more lined, her hair grayer, her body heavier and less healthy. She suffered from numerous medical problems during her time on death row: dental issues that went untreated for years, chronic digestive problems, skin conditions, severe headaches that she believed were caused by the sonic pressure devices she thought the guards were using on her. The prison medical care was minimal and often indifferent. She would submit sick call requests and wait days or weeks to be seen. Treatments were basic, medications generic, and often ineffective. Her mental health deteriorated steadily. The psychiatric medications she was prescribed, antipsychotics, mood stabilizers, antidepressants, helped to some degree, but could not address the fundamental reality. She was a severely traumatized woman living in an environment designed to destroy psychological well being, waiting to be executed. No medication could make that tolerable. By the late 1990s, Aileen was showing signs of psychosis. Her paranoid delusions intensified. She heard voices. Whether these were auditory hallucinations or the hypervigilance of PTSD is difficult to determine, but they were real to her. She became convinced that she was part of a larger conspiracy, that her execution was being delayed deliberately to prolong her suffering, that powerful forces were watching her, studying her, using her as an experiment. The prison psychiatrists who evaluated her during this period diagnosed her with a range of conditions: borderline personality disorder, PTSD, antisocial personality disorder, paranoid ideation, depression. Some suggested she was developing schizophrenia or experiencing a psychotic break, but the diagnoses did little to change her circumstances. She was medicated, monitored, and left to deteriorate in her cell. The media portrayals of Aileen during this period were often at odds with the private reality revealed in her letters and writings. In documentaries and news reports, she was presented as a monster or a curiosity, her image frozen in the mugshot from her arrest or in clips from interviews where she appeared defiant and disturbed. The public saw a serial killer, a predator, a woman who had murdered 7 men and showed no remorse. But the private Aileen, the one revealed in letters to friends and supporters, was more complex and more human. She was someone who laughed at jokes and sitcoms, who cried during sad movies, who worried about the other women on death row, who remembered birthdays and asked correspondents about their families. She was someone who felt deeply, who wanted to be loved, who was terrified of dying alone. "I'm not a monster," she wrote to a supporter in 1998. "I know that's what everyone thinks. I know that's what the media says. But I'm a person. I have feelings. I get scared and lonely and sad. I wish I could make people understand that. I wish someone would see me as more than just the terrible things I did." But the gap between how Aileen saw herself and how the world saw her was unbridgeable. To the public, she was a symbol of female violence, of the failure of the social safety net, of evil, of mental illness, of whatever narrative people wanted to impose on her. She was not allowed to be simply human, simply Aileen, because her humanity was too complicated, too uncomfortable, too challenging to the stories society tells itself about good and evil, victims and perpetrators, who deserves mercy and who deserves death. By the turn of the millennium, Aileen had been on death row for nearly a decade. Her appeals were winding down, the legal options narrowing. The Florida Supreme Court had upheld her convictions and sentences. Federal courts had declined to intervene. The machinery of execution was moving toward its inevitable conclusion, and Aileen could feel it, could sense the walls closing in. She began to talk about wanting to die, about being tired of waiting, about the cruelty of keeping someone alive just to kill them later. These conversations alarmed her attorneys and supporters, who worried that she was becoming suicidal or that she was being manipulated into giving up her appeals. But Aileen insisted she was simply being rational, that she understood her situation and preferred death to decades more of this existence. "I'm in a cage," she wrote in 2001. "I've been in this cage for almost 10 years. I can't touch another human being. I can't go outside except for 1 hour a day in another cage. I can't have any privacy. I can't make any choices about my own life. This isn't living, this is torture. And if the choice is between being tortured for another 20 years and dying, I choose dying." The letters and writings from this period are suffused with exhaustion and resignation. Aileen had fought for so long, fought to survive childhood, fought to survive on the streets, fought against the men who hurt her, fought the legal system, fought her own mental illness, and she was tired. She had nothing left to fight with, nothing left to fight for. The drowning moon had finally pulled her under, and she was ready to stop struggling, to let the water close over her head, to sink into the silence. The rain fell on Broward Correctional Institution through all those years, drumming on the roof of Death Row, washing over the concrete and razor wire, falling on the small caged yards where condemned women walked in circles, counting down the days. It fell on the graves of the victims, on the highways where they had died, on the towns where their families still lived and grieved. It fell on the whole broken system that had failed everyone involved. Failed Aileen as a child, failed to stop her as an adult, failed the men who died, failed to offer anything resembling justice or healing or redemption. And in her cell, Aileen Carol Wuornos sat alone in the quiet room, listening to the rain, waiting for the end that she now welcomed, that she had decided to embrace rather than resist. The waiting was almost over. The final act was about to begin. There is a particular kind of finality that comes with choosing one's own death, a paradoxical assertion of control in the moment of ultimate surrender. For Aileen Wuornos, who had spent her entire life subjected to the wills and violences of others, the decision to stop fighting her execution was perhaps the first truly autonomous choice she had made in years. It was also the last. The legal process that allowed condemned prisoners to volunteer for execution, to waive their remaining appeals, and accept their sentences was designed as a safeguard against prolonged suffering. But it was also controversial, raising profound questions about competency, coercion, and the state's role in facilitating its own executions. Could a person living under the psychological torture of death row truly make a free choice? Could someone with severe mental illness consent to their own death? These questions would swirl around Aileen's case in her final months, but they would not ultimately save her. In January of 2001, 9 years into her incarceration on death row, Aileen fired her appellate attorneys. She had cycled through multiple lawyers over the years, her relationships with them following the same pattern of idealization and devaluation that characterized all her relationships. She would initially embrace them, believing they would save her, and then turn on them when the appeals failed, accusing them of incompetence or conspiracy, or simply not caring enough. The final attorneys she dismissed were from the Capital Collateral Regional Council, the state funded office that represented death row inmates in their appeals. They had been working on her case for years, filing motions challenging the constitutionality of her sentence, the adequacy of her trial representation, the admissibility of evidence. But the appeals had been consistently denied by state and federal courts, and Aileen had lost faith in the process. "I'm done with this," she told them during a prison meeting. "I don't want to appeal anymore. I just want to die." The attorneys tried to dissuade her, explaining that there were still legal avenues to pursue, that giving up meant certain execution, that her mental state made it questionable whether she could competently waive her appeals. But Aileen was adamant. "I've been in here for 9 years," she said, "9 years in a cage, waiting to die. If they're going to kill me, let them do it now. I can't take another 10 years of this. I won't." The attorneys filed motions with the court arguing that Aileen was not competent to waive her appeals, that her severe mental illness, the paranoid delusions, the mood swings, the increasingly bizarre statements about sonic weapons and government conspiracies rendered her incapable of making a rational decision about her own life. They requested a competency evaluation, hoping that a psychiatrist would find her incompetent and force the continuation of the appeals, whether she wanted them or not. The competency hearing was held in April of 2001 in a Volusia County courtroom that Aileen had not seen in years. She was transported from Broward to DeLand, the journey taking several hours. Aileen shackled in the back of a prison van, watching the familiar landscape of Florida pass by. She looked older than her 45 years, her face lined and drawn, her body heavy from prison food and lack of exercise, her eyes holding the flat affect that came from years of psychiatric medication and psychic exhaustion. The hearing was brief and clinical. Dr. Harry Kropp, a forensic psychologist who had evaluated Aileen previously, testified about her mental state. He described her paranoid delusions, her belief that she was being tortured by prison guards, her conviction that there was a vast conspiracy to prolong her suffering. He noted her diagnoses: borderline personality disorder, PTSD, antisocial traits, paranoid ideation. He acknowledged that she was mentally ill. But, Dr. Kropp testified, she was not incompetent in the legal sense. She understood that she was on death row. She understood that waiving her appeals would result in her execution. She understood the finality of death. Her decision to volunteer for execution was not irrational given her circumstances. Life on death row was indeed torturous, and choosing death over indefinite torture could be seen as a rational choice, even if made by a mentally ill person. The judge agreed. On May 15th, 2001, he ruled that Aileen Carol Wuornos was competent to waive her appeals and volunteer for execution. The decision was controversial, condemned by anti death penalty advocates and mental health professionals who argued that executing a severely mentally ill woman violated the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment, but the ruling stood. An execution date was set October 9th, 2002, 17 months away. The delay was procedural, allowing time for any last minute legal challenges and for the prison to make preparations. For Aileen, the date marked the end of uncertainty, a finish line after years of waiting. She expressed relief. Finally, she told a journalist in an interview, finally, it's going to be over. The months between the competency ruling and the execution date were strange and disorienting for Aileen. Knowing the exact day she would die changed the quality of time. The days still passed slowly, but they were no longer infinite. She could count them down. 6 months left, 3 months, 1 month. The finitude was both terrifying and liberating. She gave a series of interviews during this period, speaking with journalists and documentary filmmakers who wanted to capture her final words, her final reflections on her life and crimes. Nick Broomfield returned, making his second documentary about her, Aileen: Life and Death of a Serial Killer. The interviews were disturbing and revealing, showing a woman who had deteriorated significantly since their previous conversations a decade earlier. Aileen's paranoia had intensified to the point of near psychosis. She spoke at length about the sonic pressure devices that she believed the guards were using to torture her, invisible weapons that created pressure in her head, made her teeth ache, disrupted her sleep. She described the torture with specificity and conviction, detailing the sensations, the times of day it occurred, the guards she believed were responsible. They're trying to break me, she told Broomfield. They want me to go insane before they execute me. It's part of the experiment. They're using me as a test subject. Broomfield pressed her on this, asking if she thought it was possible these sensations were the result of mental illness rather than actual weapons. Aileen became agitated, defensive. I know what's real, she said. I know the difference between my mind and what's being done to me. This is real. They're torturing me. The interviews also covered the murders, and Aileen's accounts had shifted dramatically from her trial testimony. She no longer claimed self defense in any meaningful way. Instead, she spoke about the killings with a chilling mixture of justification and fatalism. I killed them because they were bad men, she said. They were rapists, child molesters, abusers, every single one of them. I was doing society a favor by getting rid of them. When Broomfield pointed out that there was no evidence most of the victims had criminal backgrounds, that several were known as good men, Aileen became angry. "You don't know what they did to me," she said. "You weren't there. They attacked me, all of them, and I defended myself." But later in the same interview, she contradicted herself. "Maybe I did it for the money. Maybe I just got tired of being used and I decided to take instead of being taken from. Maybe I'm exactly what they say I am, a serial killer. Does it matter anymore?" The contradictions were not strategic at this point. Aileen had given up trying to save herself, given up constructing a coherent narrative that might generate sympathy or legal intervention. She was simply expressing the fractured truths of her experience, all the different versions of events that existed simultaneously in her damaged psyche. She also spoke about Tyria Moore, still, after all these years. The obsession had not faded. "I loved her," Aileen said, tears running down her face. "I loved her more than anything, and she destroyed me. She saved herself and she let me die. I'll never forgive her for that. But I also understand. She did what she had to do to survive. We both did what we had to do to survive." As the execution date approached, Aileen's mood oscillated wildly between resignation and panic, between wanting to die and being terrified of death. She would tell supporters and journalists that she was ready, that she welcomed the end, that death would be a relief from the suffering of incarceration. But in the quiet of her cell, alone with her thoughts, the fear would overwhelm her. She wrote letters expressing this terror, though many of them were never sent, found later among her possessions. "I don't want to die," she wrote in one. "I'm not ready. I'm scared. What if there's nothing after this? What if I just stop existing? What if hell is real and I'm going there?" She also wrote about regret, about the victims, about the families she had destroyed. "I'm sorry," she wrote. "I know that doesn't mean anything. That sorry doesn't bring back the dead or heal the people I hurt. But I am sorry. I think about those men every day. I see their faces. I carry them with me. And soon I'll be with them, wherever dead people go." The prison chaplain visited her regularly in the final months, a woman named Mary Daly, who had been working with death row inmates for years. Daly was not judgmental or proselytizing. She simply offered presence, a listening ear, spiritual counsel if Aileen wanted it. They would sit on opposite sides of the plexiglass barrier, connected by phone, and Aileen would talk about her fears, her regrets, her questions about God and afterlife and whether someone like her could be forgiven. "Do you think I'm going to hell?" Aileen asked during one visit. "I don't know," Daly answered honestly. "I don't think any of us knows what happens after death, but I believe in a God of mercy. I believe that God understands suffering, understands how broken people become broken, understands that you did terrible things, but that terrible things were also done to you." "But that doesn't make it okay," Aileen said. "That doesn't excuse what I did." "No," Daly agreed. "It doesn't excuse it, but maybe it explains it. And maybe there's grace even for that." The conversation offered Aileen some comfort, but the comfort was fragile, easily shattered by the return to her cell, to the isolation and the waiting, and the knowledge that in weeks, then days, then hours, she would be taken to a room and killed. She requested that there be no execution witnesses from her side. She did not want Arlene Prowl there, did not want any journalists or supporters or lawyers watching her die. The only witnesses would be the ones required by law: representatives of the state, the executioner, a doctor to pronounce death, and witnesses for the victims' families if they chose to attend. In the final week, Aileen was moved from her regular cell to a holding cell closer to the execution chamber. The cell was similar to the one she had lived in for a decade: concrete walls, metal bed, toilet, and sink. But the location was different, the atmosphere heavier with the proximity of death. She was under constant observation, a guard watching her through a window at all times to ensure she did not attempt suicide. The state was determined that she would die on their schedule by their method, that she would not be allowed to take that final choice from them. She slept poorly in those final nights, her sleep fragmented by nightmares and anxiety. She would wake in the dark, disoriented, her heart racing, the walls of the cell pressing in. She would remember where she was and why, and the reality would crash over her like a wave. Days left, hours left, minutes. On October 8th, the day before her execution, Aileen was allowed a final contact visit with Dawn Botkins, the childhood friend who had remained in sporadic contact with her over the years. Contact visits for death row inmates being executed were rare, a final mercy granted by the prison. Aileen and Dawn were allowed to sit in a small room together, no plexiglass between them, able to touch for the first time in over a decade. They hugged, and Aileen broke down, crying, clinging to Dawn, feeling the warmth of another human body, the simple comfort of physical contact that she had been denied for so long. They sat holding hands, talking quietly, crying together. "I'm scared," Aileen admitted. "I keep saying I'm ready, that I want this, but I'm scared." "I know," Dawn said. "Anyone would be." They talked about childhood, about Troy, Michigan, about the few happy memories Aileen had, playing in the woods with Keith, the brief moments when life felt almost normal. They talked about regret, about the paths not taken, about all the ways things could have been different if someone had intervened, if someone had helped, if the world had been kinder. "I could have been something else," Aileen said. "If things had been different, I could have had a normal life, a job, a family. I could have been happy." "You could have," Dawn agreed, and it was one of the saddest truths of Aileen's life. The person she could have been if she had been protected, loved, given a chance. The visit ended too soon. Dawn had to leave, had to return to the world of the living, while Aileen remained in the world of the condemned. They hugged one final time, both knowing they would never see each other again. "Take care of yourself," Aileen said. "I will," Dawn said. "I'll remember you, not for what you did, but for who you were, who you could have been." After Dawn left, Aileen was returned to her holding cell. She was offered a final meal, the tradition afforded to condemned prisoners, a last gesture of humanity before the state killed them. She could request almost anything within reason, and the prison would attempt to provide it. Aileen requested a simple meal: fried chicken, mashed potatoes, corn on the cob, sweet tea, and a slice of chocolate cake. It was comfort food, the kind of meal that might have been served at a family dinner if she had ever had a family, if dinners had ever been occasions of comfort rather than violence. The meal was delivered to her cell on the evening of October 8th. She ate slowly, savoring it, though her appetite was limited by anxiety and medication. The food tasted good, better than the standard prison fare, but it was hard to enjoy knowing it was her last. She left half the meal uneaten, her stomach too knotted to accept more. That night, her final night alive, Aileen did not sleep. She lay on the metal bunk, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the prison: distant doors clanging, footsteps in hallways, the hum of fluorescent lights. She thought about her life, all 46 years of it, the trajectory from birth to this moment. She thought about her mother, Diane, who had given her away, her father, Leo, who had killed himself, her grandfather, Laurie, who had beaten her, Keith, her brother, dead at 21, Tyria, who had loved her and betrayed her, the 7 men she had killed, the countless people who had hurt her, and the fewer people who had tried to help. She thought about what came after death. She had no firm beliefs anymore, no faith to cling to. She hoped there was something, heaven, reincarnation, some form of continued existence, but she also feared there was nothing, just an endless void, consciousness extinguished like a candle flame. Mostly, she felt tired, tired of thinking, tired of feeling, tired of being Aileen Carol Wuornos, with all the pain and chaos that identity entailed. She was ready for it to be over, ready for the silence, ready for whatever came next or didn't come. The morning of October 9th, 2002, arrived with the gray light of a cloudy Florida dawn. Aileen was awakened at 5 a.m. Though she had not truly been asleep, she was given a final shower, allowed to wash her hair, to clean herself in preparation for death. The ritual felt absurd. Why did it matter if she was clean when they were going to kill her? But she complied, standing under the lukewarm water, letting it wash over her, imagining it washing away all the years of dirt and blood and sin. She was dressed in a fresh prison uniform, the standard light blue. Her wrists and ankles were shackled. She was escorted from the holding cell through a series of corridors to the execution chamber, a small clinical room at the heart of the prison. The walk was short, less than 2 minutes, but it felt eternal. Each step was one step closer to death, each breath one of her last. The execution chamber at Florida State Prison, Aileen had been transferred from Broward to FSP in Stark the previous day for the execution, was austere and deliberately impersonal. The room was painted pale green. At its center was a gurney, padded with leather restraints attached. Beside the gurney was a metal cart holding medical equipment, IV lines, syringes, monitoring devices. The room was divided by a window of one-way glass, behind which witnesses would watch the execution. Aileen was led to the gurney. The restraints were fastened across her chest, her arms, her legs, her forehead. She was immobilized completely, her body reduced to an object upon which the state would enact its punishment. The medical team, 2 technicians, their faces masked, inserted IV lines into both her arms, threading catheters into her veins. The process was clinical, efficient, devoid of emotion. She was asked if she had any final words. The tradition of the last statement, the final opportunity for the condemned to speak, to address the witnesses, to seek or reject forgiveness, to assert their humanity one final time. Aileen spoke, her voice steady despite the fear, audible through the microphone that carried her words to the witness room. I'd just like to say I'm sailing with the rock, and I'll be back like Independence Day with Jesus, June 6th. Like the movie, big mothership and all, I'll be back. The statement was bizarre, a mixture of paranoid delusion and cultural reference, invoking the science fiction film Independence Day, conflating it with Christian imagery and her belief in conspiracies. It was quintessentially Aileen, defiant, strange, refusing to perform the expected contrition or peaceful acceptance, asserting to the end that she operated by her own logic, her own understanding of reality. But then she added, her voice softening slightly, "Yeah, I'm sorry for what I did. I really am. I wish I could take it back, but I can't. So I'm ready." The final words were recorded, transcribed, added to the official record, and then the process continued. The witnesses were seated in the room beyond the one way glass. There were 12 of them, representatives from the Florida Department of Corrections, a chaplain, a doctor, members of the media selected by lottery, and 2 family members of victims, a sister of Richard Mallory, and an adult son of Troy Burris. They sat on plastic chairs, watching through the glass as Aileen lay strapped to the gurney, waiting to die. The warden, James Crosby, gave the signal. The execution protocol began. Florida used lethal injection for executions, a three drug protocol that was designed to be humane, but which had been the subject of significant controversy. The first drug was sodium thiopental, a barbiturate that induced unconsciousness. The second was pancuronium bromide, a paralytic that stopped all muscle movement, including breathing. The third was potassium chloride, which stopped the heart. The drugs were administered through the IV lines by executioners positioned behind a wall, unseen. The process was designed to create distance, to diffuse responsibility, so that no single person bore the full weight of killing another human being. At 9:47 a.m., the first drug entered Aileen's bloodstream. She took a few deep breaths, her eyes open, staring at the ceiling. Her lips moved slightly, as though she was speaking or praying, but no sound emerged. And then her eyes closed. The sodium thiopental worked quickly, inducing unconsciousness within seconds. Aileen Carol Wuornos was no longer aware, no longer capable of feeling pain or fear or anything at all. The second drug followed. Her chest, which had been rising and falling with her breathing, stopped moving. The paralytic had taken effect. She was no longer breathing, her body kept alive only by the oxygen still circulating in her blood. The third drug was administered. The potassium chloride entered her heart, disrupting the electrical signals that kept it beating. The heart muscle contracted erratically, then stopped. The monitors attached to her body showed a flat line. At 9:47 a.m., 6 minutes after the process began, the doctor stepped forward and checked for vital signs. There were none. He pronounced Aileen Carol Wuornos dead. The witnesses sat in silence, some crying, some stone faced, all processing what they had just seen. The state had killed a human being in their presence, and whether that killing was justice or murder or something in between was a question each of them would have to answer for themselves. The curtain was drawn, blocking the view of the body. Aileen's remains would be removed from the gurney, taken to the prison morgue, prepared for release to whoever claimed them. The execution chamber would be cleaned, the gurney sanitized, the equipment reset, made ready for the next execution, the next person the state had decided deserved to die. Outside the prison, the reactions were immediate and divided. A crowd had gathered at the gates, protesters, supporters, media. Some held signs reading, Justice for the victims, celebrating the execution as righteous punishment for Aileen's crimes. Others held signs reading, Stop State Murder and Mental Illness is Not a Crime, condemning the execution as barbaric and unjust. The news spread quickly. Television networks interrupted regular programming with breaking news bulletins. Aileen Wuornos, America's most infamous female serial killer, has been executed. Newspapers prepared headlines, websites published articles, radio stations discussed the case. The media machinery that had feasted on Aileen's story for over a decade now consumed her death, turning it into content, into spectacle, into another chapter in the endless American appetite for true crime and punishment. The reactions from victims' families were complex and varied. Richard Mallory's sister, who had attended the execution as a witness, spoke to reporters afterward. She described a sense of relief, of closure, of justice finally served after 13 years of waiting. I'm glad it's over, she said. I'm glad she can't hurt anyone else. My brother can finally rest in peace. But other family members expressed more ambivalence. Shirley Humphreys, widow of Dick Humphreys, did not attend the execution. She told reporters that she had mixed feelings, that she believed Aileen deserved punishment, but that execution seemed hollow, that it brought her husband back to life or healed the wound of his loss. I don't feel better, she said. I just feel tired, tired of the whole thing. Dick is still gone, and her being dead doesn't change that. The family of David Spears, who had not attended the execution, released a statement expressing their belief that justice had been served, but also acknowledging the tragedy of Aileen's life. "What happened to our father was terrible and unforgivable," the statement read. "But we also recognize that Aileen Wuornos was a deeply damaged person who was failed by every system meant to protect her. We wish she had received help before it came to this. We wish none of this had happened." The anti death penalty movement seized on Aileen's execution as evidence of the cruelty and injustice of capital punishment. They pointed to her severe mental illness, her history of abuse and trauma, the fact that she had volunteered for execution after a decade of psychological torture on death row. Executing Aileen Wuornos, they argued, was not justice, but state sanctioned murder of a mentally ill woman who should have been hospitalized, not imprisoned, and certainly not killed. But victim advocacy groups and law and order conservatives defended the execution, arguing that Aileen had been afforded due process, had been convicted by a jury of her peers, and had been sentenced to death in accordance with the law. Her mental illness and traumatic childhood, they argued, did not excuse or justify the murder of seven innocent men. Justice required that she pay the ultimate price. The debate played out in op eds, talk shows, academic journals, and around dinner tables across the country. Aileen Wuornos in death, as in life, became a symbol onto which people projected their own beliefs about crime and punishment, about mental illness, about gender and violence, about what justice means and who deserves mercy. Aileen's body was claimed by Dawn Botkins, her childhood friend, who had remained in contact with her until the end. There was no funeral, no service, no public mourning. Dawn had Aileen cremated, and the ashes were taken to Michigan, back to the place where Aileen had been born and where her life had begun its long descent into trauma and violence. The ashes were scattered in a wooded area near Troy, Michigan, not far from where Aileen and Keith had played as children, building forts and pretending they were anywhere but where they were. There was no gravestone, no marker, no public acknowledgement of where Aileen Wuornos's remains came to rest. Dawn said a prayer, spoke a few private words, and then walked away, leaving Aileen to the earth and the silence. The anonymity of Aileen's final resting place felt fitting. She had spent her life invisible to the systems meant to protect her, visible only when she became a problem, a criminal, a headline. Even in death, she remained in the margins, unmarked, unremembered, except as a cautionary tale, a monster, a tragedy, depending on who was telling the story. The cultural legacy of Aileen Wuornos grew substantially in the years following her execution. Her story was told and retold in documentaries, books, television programs, and films, each iteration adding layers of interpretation and myth to the facts of her life. The most significant cinematic portrayal came in 2003 when director Patty Jenkins released Monster, a biographical film starring Charlize Theron as Aileen. Theron's performance was transformative and deeply empathetic, portraying Aileen not as a monster, but as a human being, showing the vulnerability beneath the violence, the pain beneath the rage. Theron gained 30 pounds, wore prosthetic teeth, adopted Aileen's mannerisms and speech patterns, immersing herself in the role completely. The film focused on Aileen's relationship with Tyria Moore, renamed Selby Wall in the film, and played by Christina Ricci. It depicted their romance with tenderness and tragedy, showing Aileen's desperate need to be loved and Tyria's inability to sustain the relationship once the violence began. The murders were portrayed as reactive rather than premeditated, the first killing shown as self defense against genuine assault, the subsequent killings as a descent into darkness driven by desperation and rage. Monster was critically acclaimed, praised for humanizing Aileen without excusing her crimes, for acknowledging the complexity of her psychology and circumstances. Theron won the Academy Award for Best Actress, accepting the award with a speech that acknowledged Aileen's humanity and the failures that led to her crimes. We like to think that people like Aileen Wuornos are monsters, Theron said in her acceptance speech, but the truth is more complicated and more sad. She was a person who was failed, who suffered, who became capable of terrible things, and if we don't understand how that happens, we can't prevent it from happening again. The film sparked renewed public discussion about Aileen's case, about the intersections of trauma, mental illness, and violence. Some viewers came away with sympathy for Aileen, seeing her as a victim who had fought back the only way she knew how. Others saw the film as revisionist, as excusing inexcusable crimes, as elevating the killer above the victims. Tyria Moore, who had disappeared into anonymity after the trial, was reportedly horrified by the film and the renewed attention it brought to her role in Aileen's life. She had built a new life far from Florida, changed her name, tried to forget. But Monster made forgetting impossible. People recognized her from the film's portrayal, asked questions, judged her for her testimony, for accepting immunity, for surviving while Aileen died. Tyria never spoke publicly about Aileen again after the trial. She gave no interviews, made no statements, left no record of her feelings or regrets. The silence was her refuge and her prison, the price of survival. The victims' families had mixed reactions to Monster. Some felt the film gave Aileen too much sympathy, that it centered her story at the expense of the men she killed. They felt their loved ones were reduced to anonymous victims, their humanity erased to make room for Aileen's narrative. Others appreciated that the film acknowledged the complexity of the case, that it didn't portray the world in simple terms of good and evil, but showed how violence begets violence, how trauma shapes people in ways that can lead to unspeakable acts. Nick Broomfield's second documentary, Aileen, Life and Death of a Serial Killer, was released the same year as Monster. The documentary included footage of Broomfield's final interviews with Aileen in the months before her execution, showing her deteriorated mental state, her paranoid delusions, her oscillation between lucidity and incoherence. The film argued that executing Aileen was morally wrong, that her mental illness made her incompetent to be executed, that the state had killed a sick woman rather than providing her with care. The documentary was powerful and disturbing, offering a counterpoint to the more sympathetic portrayal in Monster. Where Monster humanized Aileen, Broomfield's documentary showed the full extent of her psychological damage, the ways in which she had become, by the end, almost unrecognizable as the person she had once been. Both the film and the documentary contributed to Aileen's transformation into a cultural icon, a figure who represented different things to different people. To feminists, she was a symbol of patriarchal violence and the ways women are pushed to extremes. To anti death penalty advocates, she was evidence of the injustice of capital punishment. To true crime enthusiasts, she was a fascinating anomaly, a female serial killer in a field dominated by men. To mental health advocates, she was a tragic example of the failure to treat and support people with severe mental illness. But to the families of Richard Mallory, David Spears, Charles Carskadden, Troy Burress, Dick Humphreys, Walter Antonio, and Peter Seams, Aileen Wuornos was the person who had taken their loved ones away, who had caused irreparable harm, whose death brought some measure of closure but could never truly heal the wounds she had inflicted. The years passed. The media attention faded. New crimes, new trials, new executions captured the public's attention. Aileen's story receded into history, though it never disappeared entirely. Her case remained a touchstone for discussions about female violence, about serial killers, about the death penalty, about trauma and its consequences. Researchers continued to study her case, examining it from psychological, criminological, and sociological perspectives. Academic papers analyzed her borderline personality disorder, her trauma responses, the social factors that contributed to her violence. True crime writers published books about her, each offering their own interpretation of who she was and why she killed. And people continued to ask the question that had haunted her story from the beginning: what would it have taken to save her? If someone had intervened when she was a child being beaten by her grandfather, would she have killed? If she had received mental health treatment as a teenager instead of being left homeless and prostituting, would seven men still be alive? If the social safety net had caught her instead of letting her fall through, if someone had seen her as a person worth saving instead of a problem to be managed, would any of this have happened? These questions have no answers, only speculation. We cannot rewind time, cannot test alternative timelines, cannot know what Aileen Wuornos might have become under different circumstances. What we know is what happened. A damaged child became a damaged adult who killed seven people and was then killed by the state and everyone involved: victims, perpetrator, families, the system itself was diminished by it. The rain falls still, as it has fallen throughout this story. It falls on Florida, on the highways where the killings occurred, on the prison where Aileen died. It falls on Michigan, on the woods where her ashes were scattered, on the streets of Troy where a child once played and dreamed of being loved. It falls on the graves of the victims, on the homes of their families, on all the places touched by this tragedy. The sound of rain is constant, eternal, washing over everything, cleansing nothing. It is the soundtrack of loss and grief, of violence and its aftermath, of cycles that repeat because we refuse to learn from them. The rain falls on the systems that failed Aileen, the child protective services that never removed her from an abusive home, the schools that expelled her instead of helping her, the courts that incarcerated her instead of treating her, the society that condemned her without ever asking why she became what she became. And the rain falls on the question we still refuse to answer: how many Aileen Wuornoses are out there right now? Children being abused and neglected, teenagers being exploited and traumatized, adults cycling through homelessness and addiction and the criminal justice system, people on the edge of violence because violence is all they have ever known. How many future victims could be saved by intervening now, by funding mental health services, by protecting vulnerable children, by creating a society that cares for its most damaged members before they become dangerous? The drowning moon hangs heavy over all of it, its light cold and merciless, illuminating the truth we would rather not see: that Aileen Wuornos was created by the world she was born into, shaped by every blow and every rape and every abandonment, forged in the fires of neglect and violence into someone capable of inflicting that same violence on others. She was not born a killer. She was made into one, piece by piece, trauma by trauma, failure by failure. This does not excuse what she did. The men she killed were human beings with lives and families and futures. Their deaths were tragedies that cannot be justified or rationalized away. They deserved to live. They deserved justice. But justice is not just punishment after the fact. It is prevention before the harm occurs. It is protecting children like Aileen before they become killers. It is addressing trauma before it metastasizes into violence. We failed Aileen Wuornos. We failed her as a child, as a teenager, as an adult. Every system meant to protect and serve her instead pushed her further toward the edge until she fell completely. And when she killed, we responded with the same violence that had defined her life, executing her instead of examining the conditions that created her: the quiet room where Aileen spent her final decade, the cell where she waited to die, was both real and metaphorical. It was a physical space, 6 feet by 9 feet, concrete and metal, a cage within a cage. But it was also the internal space of her mind, the isolation of severe mental illness, the loneliness of a person who had never truly been known or loved or understood. She died alone, strapped to a gurney, sedated and paralyzed and stopped, her heart ceasing its rhythm, her consciousness extinguished. The state called it justice. Others called it murder. Both are true. Both are inadequate to describe the enormous tragedy of what happened, the waste of multiple lives, the failure of imagination and compassion that allowed it all to occur. In the end, Aileen Carol Wuornos was somebody's daughter. She was a person born with the same capacity for love and growth and goodness as anyone else. But that capacity was crushed before it could flourish, destroyed by the very people and systems meant to nurture it. What remained was a shell, a wounded animal, a person so damaged that killing became a form of communication, violence, the only language she knew how to speak. She is gone now, her ashes scattered, her body returned to the earth. But her story remains a mirror held up to society, reflecting back all the ways we fail our most vulnerable members, all the cycles of violence we perpetuate through neglect and indifference, and the willful refusal to see. The rain falls, steady and eternal, washing over the roads she traveled, the places she lived, the prison where she died. It falls on the quiet room, empty now, waiting for the next condemned person, the next life caught in the machinery of the criminal justice system, the next ending that could have been prevented but wasn't. Listen to the rain. Let it fill the silence. Let it remind you that some stories have no happy endings, no redemption, no catharsis. Some stories are just pain accumulated over decades, ending in more pain, leaving nothing but grief and unanswered questions, and the terrible knowledge that it didn't have to be this way. Aileen Carol Wuornos, born February 29th, 1956. Executed October 9th, 2002. Somebody's daughter, somebody's sister, somebody's lover, somebody's victim, somebody's nightmare, somebody who might have been saved if anyone had cared to try. The rain falls, and in the silence between the drops, we are left to sit with what we have learned, with the discomfort of acknowledging that monsters are made, not born, and that we are all complicit in their making when we allow children to suffer, when we ignore the signs, when we choose punishment over prevention, when we execute the damaged instead of healing the wounds that damaged them. This is the story of Aileen Wuornos. It is a true story, a terrible story, a story that America has told itself many times in many ways, but it is also our story, a reflection of who we are and what we value, of the society we have built and the people we have left behind. The drowning moon has set, the night is over, and we are left with the dawn, with the choice of what to do with the knowledge we have gained, with the question of whether we will learn from this tragedy or simply move on to the next one, allowing the cycle to continue, unbroken and unending. The rain falls. Listen. As the final shadows fall on this story, if you found yourself drifting away or simply appreciate a quiet mystery, consider subscribing to Midnight Narrative. Gently tap that like button to help more quiet seekers find us. And for more stories to help you unwind, explore our other videos right here. Don't forget to ring the notification bell if you wish to be softly alerted when a new narrative begins. Until next time, may your sleep be deep and your mysteries shallow.